You suffer more when you hold on to what life is trying to remove, because deep down, you still hope it will stay. You still try to protect it, explain it, fix it, or bring it back. But if holding on could save you, then why does it leave you in more pain? Why does the heart grow heavier the more it clings? Why do old endings still haunt you, broken connections still drain you, and fading seasons still live inside you long after life has already moved on? The truth is, suffering does not only come from loss. It comes from resisting the loss, from begging what is ending to remain. And Buddhist wisdom reveals the deeper lesson. Peace begins the moment you stop fighting the natural flow of life. For centuries, the Buddha and the wisest teachers understood that attachment is what turns pain into torment, and that letting go is not weakness, but the doorway to freedom. Tonight, as you listen to these teachings, something inside you will begin to loosen. Your mind will stop gripping what is already slipping away. The pressure in your chest will begin to soften, and a quiet calm will start to rise within you, like the first light after a long, dark night. And when you wake up tomorrow, you may finally understand that life was not trying to punish you by removing certain things. It was trying to free you. This is not just another audio to fall asleep to. This is a lesson your heart may have needed for a long time. Are you ready? Let's begin. Something inside you already knows this truth, even if you have been avoiding it. There is a quiet tension you carry, a subtle resistance that shows up when something begins to slip away. It could be a person, a plan, a version of your life, or even a version of yourself. And instead of allowing it to move, something in you tightens. You hold on a little longer. You think a little harder. You try one more time. And that is where this next lesson begins. A part of you believes that holding on is harmless, even necessary. But what if the very act of clinging is where the deeper pain is being created? Let's step into it. There is a kind of violence that does not leave bruises, does not raise voices, and does not look dangerous from the outside. It hides in silence. It disguises itself as love, as effort, as loyalty. But inside, it creates pressure, tension, and quiet suffering that slowly wears you down. This is the hidden violence of emotional clinging. It begins the moment life starts to move something away from you, and instead of letting that movement happen, your mind resists it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. It whispers, "This should not be happening." It argues, "This can still be fixed." It insists, "I cannot lose this." At first, it feels reasonable, it feels human. But over time, it becomes exhausting, because life does not pause just because you are not ready. When something begins to leave, whether it is a relationship, an opportunity, or a phase of life, there is a natural process unfolding. It is not always comfortable, but it is necessary. It is like a season changing. The leaves fall, not because the tree is failing, but because something new is preparing to grow. But the mind does not always see it that way. The mind tries to hold the leaves in place. It tries to glue them back to the branches. It tries to convince itself that if it just tries harder, nothing will change. And in doing so, it creates friction. That friction is suffering. You begin to feel restless. Thoughts loop endlessly. Sleep becomes lighter. Emotions become heavier. And even when nothing is happening externally, something inside you feels unsettled, like a constant background noise you cannot turn off. This is not because life is attacking you. It is because you are resisting life. Clinging often comes from a misunderstanding of what it means to care. Many people believe that to love something deeply means to hold on to it tightly, to never let it go, to fight for it no matter what. But there is a difference between caring and controlling. Caring allows space, it allows change, it allows things to evolve, even if that evolution leads them away from you. Control, on the other hand, tries to freeze everything in place. It tries to keep people the same, keep situations unchanged, keep emotions predictable. And that is where the violence begins. Because nothing in life is designed to stay the same. People grow, feelings shift, circumstances change, and when your mind refuses to accept that, it begins to push against reality itself. Think about how exhausting that is. It is like standing in a river and trying to stop the current with your hands. The water keeps moving, but you keep pushing back. At some point, it is not the river that is hurting you. It is the effort of resisting it. Clinging also creates a kind of illusion. It makes you believe that something is still within your reach when it has already started to move beyond you. You replay memories as if they are still happening. You hold on to conversations as if they are still alive. You keep expecting outcomes that no longer belong to the present. And because of that, you remain emotionally tied to something that no longer exists in the same way. This creates confusion. Part of you knows it is over, but another part refuses to accept it. And so you live in between, not fully holding on, not fully letting go. That in-between space is where suffering grows the most. It drains your energy because you are constantly trying to maintain something that is already dissolving. It affects your mood because you are attached to an outcome that is no longer unfolding. It even affects your sense of self because you are holding on to an identity that was connected to what is leaving. For example, when a relationship ends, the pain is not only about losing the person, it is also about losing the version of yourself that existed within that relationship. You are not just letting go of them, you are letting go of who you were with them, and that is why the mind resists so strongly. It is not just protecting the external connection, it is protecting your internal sense of meaning. But here is where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself. Clinging does not actually preserve anything. It does not bring people back. It does not restore what has changed. It does not rewind time. All it does is keep you stuck in a moment that life has already moved past. And the longer you stay there, the more disconnected you become from the present. You stop seeing new opportunities because your attention is fixed on what is gone. You stop feeling light because your energy is tied to something heavy. You stop moving forward because part of you is still trying to move backward. This is why emotional clinging is so powerful. Not because it holds things together, but because it holds you back. There is also a subtle fear underneath all of this. A fear that if you let go, it means it did not matter. A fear that releasing something is the same as losing it completely. A fear that if you stop holding on, you will be left with nothing. But that fear is not truth. It is just the mind trying to protect you from uncertainty, because letting go often leads to a space that feels unfamiliar, and the mind does not like unfamiliar spaces. It prefers something painful that it understands over something peaceful that it does not yet recognize. So it keeps you attached, it keeps you replaying, it keeps you hoping. But peace does not live in that cycle. Peace begins the moment you stop forcing something to stay. It begins when you acknowledge that something is changing, even if you do not fully understand why. It begins when you allow life to move without needing to control every direction it takes. This does not mean you become indifferent. It does not mean you stop caring. It means you care without trying to possess. There is a quiet strength in that, a strength that does not come from holding tighter, but from knowing when to release. When you stop clinging, something shifts inside you. The tension begins to dissolve. The mind becomes less crowded. The emotional weight starts to lift, not instantly, not all at once, but gradually. You begin to feel space where there was once pressure. You begin to notice moments of calm where there was once constant thinking. You begin to reconnect with the present instead of being trapped in the past. And slowly you realize something important. Letting go did not destroy you, it revealed you. It showed you that you are not defined by what you hold on to. You are not limited by what leaves. You are not broken because something changed. You are still here, still breathing, still capable of experiencing life in a new way. And that is where freedom begins. Not in controlling everything around you, but in releasing the need to. Because life will always move, things will come and go, and the more you allow that movement, the less you suffer from it. Clinging may feel like protection, but it is often the source of pain. Letting go may feel like loss, but it is often the beginning of peace. And once you truly understand that, you start to live differently. You stop chasing what is already leaving. You stop forcing what no longer fits. You stop holding on to what is quietly asking to be released. And in that space, something new begins to grow. Not because you forced it, but because you finally made room for it. Let's continue. And as that space begins to open within you, something else quietly reveals itself. Letting go is not always a clean break, even after. You loosen your grip. Even after you accept that something is leaving, there is still a part of the mind that lingers at the door. It does not fully walk away. It turns back. It wonders. It questions. Because even when life has already closed something, the mind does not always follow. There is a strange pull that draws you backward, not because the past is still alive, but because something in you is not ready to leave it behind. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a quiet habit the mind has, one that feels harmless at first, but slowly deepens suffering in ways most people do not notice. It is the habit of reopening doors that have already been closed. A message you almost send, a memory you replay again and again, a conversation you reconstruct in your head, changing the words, hoping for a different ending. Something in you keeps returning, as if there is still something left to fix, something left to understand, something left to recover. But what if there is nothing left there? What if the door is not just closed, but completed? This is one of the most difficult truths to accept. Because the mind does not like unfinished feelings. It searches for closure the way a wound searches for healing. It wants clarity. It wants answers. It wants a sense that everything has been resolved. And when it does not get that, it tries to create it on its own. It goes back into the past, replaying moments, analyzing details, rewriting outcomes, trying to extract meaning from something that has already ended. But the more it returns, the more it reopens what was already beginning to heal. This is how old wounds stay alive, not because they were never given time to close, but because they are constantly being touched again. Every time you revisit a memory with attachment, you bring the emotion back with it. The body reacts as if it is happening again. The mind tightens, the heart contracts, and suddenly something that happened long ago feels present again. This is the quiet power of attachment. It does not just hold on to the past, it recreates it. There is also a deeper layer to this pattern. Sometimes the mind reopens old doors because it believes there is still something to gain, a sense of validation, a different outcome, a final moment that proves it mattered. It tells itself, if I just understand it better, I will feel better. But understanding is not always what heals you. Sometimes what heals you is acceptance. Acceptance that not everything will make sense. Acceptance that not every ending will feel complete. Acceptance that some doors close without explanation, without fairness, without warning. And the more you try to force clarity where there is none, the more you stay trapped in confusion. There is also the pull of emotional familiarity. Even painful memories can feel familiar. And the mind, in its own way, prefers what is familiar over what is unknown. So it returns to what it knows, even if what it knows hurts. It goes back to the same thoughts, the same scenarios, the same feelings, not because they bring peace, but because they feel recognizable. This is why people sometimes stay attached to pain, not because they enjoy it, but because they understand it. And letting go would mean stepping into something uncertain. But there is something important to see here. Every time you reopen a closed door, you delay your movement forward. You stay tied to something that no longer exists in the same form. You invest energy into something that is no longer growing. And over time, this creates a kind of emotional stagnation. Life continues to move, but you remain mentally anchored in a place that has already passed. This is where the real cost appears. Not just in the pain you feel, but in the life you are not fully living. Because part of your attention is always elsewhere. Part of your presence is always behind you. And as long as that is the case, the present moment never receives your full awareness. This is why reopening old doors is not just about the past. It is about what it takes away from your present. It takes your clarity, it takes your energy, it takes your ability to experience new moments without the shadow of old ones interfering. There is also something the mind does that feels very convincing. It creates the illusion that going back will bring relief. It says, if I just revisit this one more time, I will finally let it go. But most of the time, it does the opposite. It strengthens the attachment. It deepens the emotional imprint. It makes the memory more active, more vivid, more difficult to release. This is why healing often requires something that feels counterintuitive. Not going back, but stepping away. Not analyzing more, but allowing less. Not reopening, but closing gently and completely. This does not mean you ignore what happened. It does not mean you suppress your feelings. It means you stop feeding the loop that keeps it alive. You allow the memory to exist without constantly engaging with it. You let it settle without disturbing it. And over time, something begins to change. The intensity fades. The emotional charge softens. The memory becomes quieter. Not because you forced it to disappear, but because you stopped giving it new energy. There is also a shift in how you relate to the past. Instead of seeing it as something unfinished, you begin to see it as something complete. Not perfect, not ideal, but complete in the sense that it has already happened and cannot be changed. And in that recognition, there is a kind of peace. A quiet acceptance that frees you from the need to return, because you realize that nothing you do now can rewrite what has already occurred. But you can choose how much of your present you give to it, and that choice is where your freedom lives. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to emerge. Sometimes what feels unfinished is not meant to be resolved externally. It is meant to be released internally. The closure you are seeking is not in the past. It is in your willingness to stop chasing it. And when you reach that point, something shifts. The urge to reopen the door begins to weaken. The need to revisit begins to fade. And in its place, there is a growing sense of stillness, a sense that you are no longer pulled backward by something that has already ended. This does not happen all at once. There will still be moments when the mind drifts back, moments when you feel the pull, but each time you have a choice, to follow the habit or to return to the present. And each time you choose the present, you strengthen your ability to let go. This is not about forgetting, it is about no longer being controlled by what you remember. It is about carrying your experiences without letting them carry you. And that is where real peace begins to take root. Because once you stop reopening what has already closed, you begin to see something clearly. Life is not waiting for you in the past. It is unfolding here, in this moment, in this breath, in this quiet space that becomes available when you finally stop going back. And as you remain here, something else begins to open. Not a door from the past, but a doorway into something new. Something that was always there, but could not be seen while your attention was elsewhere. And this is how you begin to move forward, not by forcing yourself to forget, but by allowing yourself to stay, right here, where life is still happening. Let's continue. And as you begin to stay in the present instead of returning to what has already closed, another truth slowly rises to the surface. It is not only that the past is over, it is that everything, even what feels stable right now, is already changing. There is a quiet movement in life that never stops. It does not ask for permission. It does not wait for readiness. It simply continues, gently and constantly, reshaping everything it touches. And yet, something in the human heart still tries to bargain with it. A soft resistance appears. A silent plea forms. A hope that this moment, this person, this version of life might stay just a little longer. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a subtle pain that comes not from losing something, but from asking it to remain when it is already beginning to fade. A quiet discomfort that sits in the chest when you feel something changing, but you are not ready to let it change. A kind of emotional whisper that says, "Not yet, just a little longer." This is where the mind begins to negotiate with impermanence. It does not always sound dramatic. Sometimes it shows up in small ways. You linger longer than necessary. You hold conversations that have already lost their depth. You keep revisiting a feeling that no longer feels the same. And beneath all of that is a quiet hope that if you stay long enough, if you care deeply enough, if you try just a little harder, something will reverse. But impermanence does not reverse. It moves forward, whether you follow it or not. This is one of the most difficult truths to accept, because it touches everything. Not just loss, but beauty as well. Not just endings, but beginnings. Everything that comes will also go. And the mind struggles with that. It wants permanence. It wants certainty. It wants to hold on to moments that feel meaningful and keep them untouched by time. But life does not work that way. Every moment is already passing while you are in it. Every connection is already shifting while you are experiencing it. And peace begins when you stop trying to interrupt that movement. There is a deep exhaustion that comes from constantly negotiating with change. Trying to convince something to stay when it is already leaving is like trying to hold on to a breath that has already been released. The more you try to pull it back, the more tension you create. And that tension quietly builds over time. It shows up as anxiety, as restlessness, as a subtle dissatisfaction that never fully goes away. Because part of you is always resisting what is happening. But there is another way to live, a way that does not involve chasing permanence, but understanding it. A way that does not involve holding tighter, but seeing more clearly. This is the Buddhist art of not begging impermanence to stay. It begins with a simple but profound shift. Instead of asking, "How can I keep this?" you begin to ask, "Can I allow this to be what it is, even if it changes?" That question alone changes everything, because it removes the pressure. It removes the silent demand that life must remain the same for you to feel okay. And in its place, it creates space. Space to experience without gripping, space to feel without controlling, space to appreciate without needing to preserve. There is something very freeing about this, because when you stop negotiating with what is fading, you begin to see its beauty more clearly. You realize that part of what makes something meaningful is the fact that it does not last forever. A moment becomes precious not because it stays, but because it passes. A connection becomes deep not because it is permanent, but because it was real while it existed. And when you see this, your relationship with change begins to soften. You no longer see it as an enemy. You begin to see it as part of the natural rhythm of life. Like waves rising and falling, like seasons shifting, like the quiet transition from day to night. There is also a deeper level to this understanding. Begging impermanence to stay often comes from the belief that your peace depends on what you are holding on to, that if this person stays, you will be okay. If this moment continues, you will feel complete. If this version of life remains, you will feel secure. But that belief creates dependence. It ties your inner state to something that is constantly changing. And because of that, your peace becomes unstable. It rises and falls with circumstances. It depends on things that were never meant to be controlled. But when you stop begging, something shifts. You begin to realize that your peace does not have to come from what stays. It can come from how you relate to what changes. This is where real stability begins, not in holding on to things, but in no longer needing them to remain the same for you to feel grounded. There is also a quiet dignity in letting things go without desperation, in allowing someone to leave without chasing, in allowing a moment to pass without clinging, in allowing a phase of life to end without trying to extend it artificially. This does not mean you do not feel. You still feel deeply. You still care. You still experience loss. But there is no struggle layered on top of that feeling. There is no added suffering created by resistance. There is just the natural flow of emotion moving through you without being blocked. And because of that, it does not stay as long. It does not become heavy. It does not turn into something that defines you. It simply passes, as all things do. There is also a quiet trust that begins to grow. A trust that life is not taking something away without reason. That what is fading is making space for something else. Not necessarily something better in a dramatic sense, but something aligned with where you are now. And when you trust that process, you stop needing to control it. You stop needing to understand every ending. You allow life to unfold without constant interference. This does not mean you become passive. It means you become aligned. You act where action is needed, but you do not resist what is already beyond your control. You participate in life, but you do not try to dominate it. And in that balance, there is peace. There is also a deep sense of relief that comes when you finally stop negotiating. When you stop asking, why is this happening, and begin to accept this is happening. That acceptance is not defeat, it is clarity. It is the moment you stop fighting what already is, and in that moment, the inner tension begins to dissolve. The mind becomes quieter, the body relaxes, and something inside you begins to feel lighter. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer resisting what is real. This is the quiet freedom of letting things be temporary, of allowing life to move without needing to hold on to every piece of it. And when you live this way, something beautiful begins to happen. You start to experience life more fully, because you are not distracted by the need to preserve it. You are present with it. You feel moments as they are, without trying to extend them. You connect with people as they are, without trying to control their role in your life. You move through phases as they come, without trying to hold on to what has already begun to shift. And in that presence, there is a depth of experience that clinging can never provide, because clinging is always focused on what is slipping away. Presence is rooted in what is here, and when you live from presence, you are no longer chasing stability outside of you. You begin to find it within, a quiet steadiness that does not depend on things staying the same, a calm that remains even as life continues to change. And that is the essence of this lesson, not forcing things to stay, not begging moments to remain, but allowing everything to be what it is, for as long as it is. And when it begins to fade, letting it fade without resistance. Because in that release, you are not losing life. You are flowing with it. Let's continue. And as you begin to flow with life instead of trying to stop it, something else becomes painfully clear. Letting things pass naturally brings relief, but resisting them stretches the pain far beyond its original moment. What was once brief begins to feel endless. What should have faded quietly begins to echo for years. And that is where this next truth reveals itself. There is a kind of pain that arrives, touches your life, and then slowly begins to leave on its own. It comes with loss, disappointment, change, or endings. It feels sharp at first, heavy in the chest, difficult to ignore, but like a storm, it is not meant to stay forever. Yet for many people, it does stay, not because the event continues, but because something inside refuses to let it end. This is how attachment turns temporary pain into lifelong suffering. The moment something is lost, there is a natural emotional response. The body reacts, the heart tightens, the mind becomes aware of the absence. This is not wrong. This is part of being human. Pain, in its natural form, is simply a signal that something meaningful has changed. But what happens next determines everything. If the pain is allowed to move, to rise and fall without interference, it begins to soften. It may take time, but it gradually loses its intensity. It becomes something you remember, not something you are trapped inside. But when attachment enters, the process changes. Instead of allowing the pain to pass, the mind begins to hold on to it. It begins to replay the moment. It begins to question what could have been different. It begins to build stories around it. And slowly, the pain stops being a passing experience. It becomes a place you live in. This is the private prison that many people never realize they have built. From the outside, life continues. Days pass, conversations happen, responsibilities are fulfilled. But internally, something remains stuck in a single moment. A moment that has already ended. This is the quiet danger of attachment. It does not just hold on to what was lost, it holds on to the pain of losing it. And it does so in subtle ways, through thoughts that repeat without resolution, through emotions that feel as fresh as the day they began, through patterns that keep pulling your attention back to the same place. At first, it may feel like you are processing, it may feel like you are trying to understand, but over time, it becomes clear that you are not moving through the pain. You are circling it. And every time you circle it, you deepen its presence in your life. There is also something important to notice here. The original pain may have lasted days, weeks, or even months, but the suffering created by attachment can last years, not because the event continues, but because the mind continues to engage with it. It is like reopening a wound every time it begins to heal, not intentionally, but habitually. Because the mind believes that staying connected to the pain is a form of loyalty, a way of honoring what was lost, a way of proving that it mattered. But in reality, it does something else. It keeps you tied to a moment that life has already moved beyond. And because of that, your energy remains anchored in the past. Your attention is divided. Your presence is incomplete. This affects more than just your thoughts. It affects how you see the world. When you carry unresolved pain, it begins to shape your expectations. You become cautious where you were once open. You become guarded where you were once trusting. You begin to anticipate loss, even in situations where it has not yet appeared. This is how temporary pain begins to influence your entire experience of life. Not because it is still happening, but because it has not been released. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this. Attachment often convinces you that letting go of the pain means letting go of the meaning. It creates the illusion that if you stop feeling the hurt, you are somehow diminishing what the experience meant to you. So you hold on to it, you keep it alive, you revisit it, not just because it hurts, but because it mattered. But there is a misunderstanding in that. You do not need to carry the pain to remember the meaning. You do not need to suffer to prove that something was important. Meaning can remain without attachment. But the mind does not always see that clearly. It confuses intensity with significance. It believes that the stronger the emotion, the deeper the value, and so it keeps the pain close, even when it is no longer necessary. This is where suffering becomes prolonged, not because you are weak, but because you are human, because you care, because you remember. because you are trying to make sense of something that changed you. But here is where the shift begins. You start to recognize that pain is not meant to be carried forever. It is meant to be experienced, understood, and then released. Not pushed away, not denied, but allowed to complete its cycle. This requires something difficult. It requires you to stop feeding the patterns that keep the pain active. To notice when the mind begins to replay. To recognize when you are stepping back into the same emotional space. And to gently bring yourself back to the present. This is not about force. It is about awareness. Each time you choose not to engage with the old story, you weaken its hold on you. Each time you allow a thought to pass without attaching to it, you create space, and over time, that space grows. The pain begins to feel less immediate, less consuming, less defining. It does not disappear completely, but it changes. It becomes something you can hold without being overwhelmed. Something you can remember without being pulled back into it. And in that shift, the prison begins to open. There is also a sense of relief that comes when you realize that you are not required to suffer indefinitely. That the continuation of pain is not a measure of strength. That healing does not mean forgetting, but it does mean releasing the need to stay attached. This is where freedom begins to take shape. Not in avoiding pain, but in allowing it to move through you without turning it into a permanent state. Because life will always include moments of loss. That part cannot be avoided. But the duration of suffering, that is something you have influence over, not by controlling what happens, but by changing how you relate to what has already happened. And when you begin to do that, something shifts. The weight you have been carrying starts to feel lighter. The thoughts that once felt overwhelming become quieter. The emotional intensity begins to soften, and for the first time in a long time, you feel a sense of movement. Not stuck, not trapped, but gradually moving forward. This does not happen instantly. There will still be moments when the past feels close, moments when the pain resurfaces. But those moments no longer define your entire experience. They become part of your story, not the place you live. And this is the difference. Attachment keeps you inside the pain. Awareness allows you to move through it. And as you continue to move, something else begins to emerge, a deeper understanding that you are not your pain. You are the one experiencing it. And because of that, you are also capable of releasing it. Not by force, not by denial, but by allowing it to complete. By no longer holding on to what has already begun to pass. And in that release, something new becomes possible. Not just the absence of suffering, but the presence of peace. A quiet, steady peace that does not depend on what has been lost. A peace that comes from no longer being bound to it. And once you experience that, even briefly, you begin to see something clearly. You do not need to carry everything that happens to you. You can feel deeply without holding on tightly. You can experience loss without becoming trapped in it. You can move forward without leaving yourself behind, and that is where true healing begins. Let's continue, and as that quiet sense of movement begins to return, as you slowly step out of the weight of what once held you back, another layer of truth starts to surface. You begin to notice that it was not only the past you were holding on to, and not only the pain you were carrying. There was something deeper, something more hidden, something that shaped how you saw your entire life. A silent expectation, a version of life you believed was supposed to happen. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a kind of grief that does not come from losing what you had, but from losing what you thought you would have. It does not always show itself clearly. It does not always come with obvious endings or visible changes. Sometimes it sits quietly beneath your thoughts, shaping how you feel without fully revealing why. a subtle sense that something is missing, a quiet disappointment that lingers even when life looks fine on the surface, a feeling that things did not turn out the way they were supposed to. This is the grief of unrealized expectations, and it can be one of the hardest forms of attachment to release, because it is not tied to something real that you can point to. It is tied to an idea, a vision, a story you carried in your mind for years, a life you believed you were owed. Maybe it was a relationship that was supposed to last. Maybe it was a career path that was meant to succeed. Maybe it was a version of yourself that you thought you would become by now. Whatever it was, it lived in your mind as a kind of certainty. Not always consciously, but quietly, in the background. And when life moved in a different direction, something inside you resisted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because it did not feel like something simply changed. It felt like something was taken. This is where suffering begins to take a different form. It is no longer just about letting go of what happened. It is about letting go of what you believed should have happened. And that can be much harder, because expectations create emotional attachments to outcomes that have not even occurred. They build a future in your mind and then ask reality to match it. And when reality does not follow that script, the mind feels betrayed. It questions. It compares. It wonders why things turned out this way instead of the way it imagined. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to carry a quiet resentment, not always toward others, but toward life itself, a sense that something is unfair, that something did not go the way it was meant to. But here is where a deeper understanding begins to form. Life does not follow the plans of the mind. It unfolds in its own way, shaped by countless factors beyond your control, and when you hold too tightly to a specific version of how things should be, you create a constant tension between expectation and reality. That tension is where suffering lives, because no matter how much you wish for things to align with your expectations, life continues to move as it is, and the more you resist that, the more disconnected you feel. There is also something else happening beneath the surface. The version of life you thought you were owed often becomes part of your identity. It becomes a reference point for how you measure yourself. If things go according to that version, you feel successful, fulfilled, complete. If they do not, you feel lacking, behind, incomplete. And this creates a fragile sense of self, because your worth becomes tied to whether life matches your expectations. This is a heavy burden to carry, because it means your peace is always dependent on outcomes that are never fully within your control. This is why letting go of these imagined versions is so important. Not because your dreams were wrong, not because your hopes were misplaced, but because holding on to a fixed idea of how life must unfold limits your ability to experience what is actually happening. It closes you off from new possibilities. It keeps you attached to something that does not exist in the present, and because of that, it prevents you from fully living where you are. There is also a quiet fear that often comes with releasing these expectations, a fear that if you let go of the life you thought you would have, you are settling, that you are giving up, that you are accepting less. But letting go is not the same as settling. It is not about lowering your standards or abandoning your desires. It is about releasing the rigid attachment to one specific outcome and allowing life to unfold in ways you may not have planned. It is about opening yourself to possibilities that your past expectations could not have predicted, because sometimes what you thought you wanted was based on a limited understanding of yourself, based on who you were at a certain point in time. But as you grow, your needs change, your perspective shifts, and the life that once seemed perfect may no longer fit who you are becoming. This is a natural part of growth. But when you cling to the old vision, you resist that growth. You try to force yourself into a version of life that no longer aligns with you. And that creates internal conflict. You feel pulled in different directions. Part of you wants to move forward, but another part is still holding on to what was supposed to be. And this tension can feel exhausting, because you are trying to live in the present while still being attached to an imagined past or future. This is where the practice of letting go becomes essential, not as an act of loss, but as an act of alignment. You begin to gently release the idea that life had to look a certain way for you to be okay. You allow yourself to grieve what did not happen without turning that grief into a permanent state. You acknowledge the disappointment, the sadness, the sense of something missing, but you do not stay there. You let it move, and as it moves, something begins to open. A new sense of possibility, a new way of seeing your life, not as something that failed to meet expectations, but as something that is still unfolding. There is also a quiet freedom in this. When you are no longer tied to a specific outcome, you become more present. You begin to notice what is actually here, instead of constantly comparing it to what you thought should be. You begin to appreciate moments for what they are, not for how they measure against an expectation. And this creates a different kind of fulfillment, one that is not based on achieving a predetermined version of life, but on experiencing life as it unfolds. This does not mean you stop having goals or desires. It means you hold them lightly. You allow them to guide you, but not control you. You pursue what matters to you, but you remain open to the way things develop. And in that openness, there is less resistance, less frustration, less suffering, because you are no longer fighting reality. You are moving with it. There is also a deeper sense of trust that begins to form. A trust that even if life does not match your expectations, it is still offering you something to learn, something to grow from, something to experience. And when you trust that, you stop seeing deviations from your plan as failures. You begin to see them as part of a larger unfolding, a path that may not look the way you imagined, but still holds meaning. And this changes how you relate to disappointment. It becomes less about what you lost and more about what is still possible. Less about what did not happen and more about what can still happen. And in that shift, something inside you begins to feel lighter. The weight of unmet expectations starts to lift. The pressure to make life fit a certain mold begins to fade, and you start to breathe differently, not with tension, but with acceptance, not with resistance, but with openness. And in that space, a new kind of clarity emerges. A clarity that does not come from everything going according to plan, but from understanding that your peace does not depend on the plan at all. It comes from your ability to let go of what no longer serves you, including the expectations that once shaped your vision of life. And as you continue to release those expectations, you begin to discover something surprising. You are not losing your life, you are finding it. Not the version you imagined, but the one that is actually yours. The one that exists here, now, unfolding in its own way. And when you finally allow yourself to be with that, without comparison, without resistance, without attachment to what could have been, something shifts. You feel more grounded, more present, more at peace, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer fighting what is. And that is where true freedom begins. Let's continue. And as you begin to release the life you thought you were owed, something else quietly comes into focus. It is not only expectations that stay with you, it is people, not physically, not in the way they once were, but emotionally, in a space that remains active long after everything has already ended. You move forward in time, but something inside you stays behind. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a weight that many people carry without realizing it. It does not show on the outside. It does not make noise. But it sits in the heart, quietly shaping how you feel, how you think, and how you move through life. It is the weight of relationships that have already expired but have not been released. There are connections that once felt alive, meaningful, even necessary. They had energy, presence, a sense of movement. But over time, something changed. The connection weakened, the communication faded, the understanding disappeared, and eventually the relationship ended, at least externally. But internally, it often continues, not in the same form, but in a subtle, persistent way. You carry the memory, you carry the emotional imprint, you carry the version of that person that once existed in your life, and because of that, the relationship never fully leaves. This is where suffering begins to take root again, not because the relationship is still happening, but because you are still carrying it as if it is. There is something the mind does when a relationship ends. It does not just let it go, it tries to preserve it. Not the reality of what it became, but the feeling of what it once was. It holds on to the good moments, the connection, the sense of familiarity, the version of that person who made you feel understood, valued, or seen. And in doing so, it creates a kind of emotional attachment that continues even in the absence of the relationship itself. This is why you can still feel affected by someone who is no longer part of your life. Because the connection is no longer external, but internal. It lives in your thoughts, your memories, your emotional patterns, and as long as it lives there, it continues to influence you. There is also a deeper layer to this. Sometimes you are not just carrying the person, you are carrying what they represented, a sense of belonging, a feeling of being chosen, a version of yourself that felt complete in their presence, and when that is gone, it creates a kind of emptiness. Not just because they are gone, but because what they gave you is no longer there in the same way. So you hold on to it. Not consciously, but subtly. You revisit memories. You replay conversations. You think about what could have been different. And without realizing it, you keep the relationship alive inside you. But here is the truth that often goes unnoticed. What you are holding on to is no longer real. Not in the present. It is a memory, a projection, an emotional imprint. But the mind treats it as if it is still active. And because of that, it continues to respond to it. This creates a kind of emotional confusion. Part of you knows the relationship is over, but another part still feels connected, still invested, still affected. And this split creates tension. Because you are trying to move forward while still carrying something from the past. It is like trying to walk while holding on to something that is pulling you backward. Eventually, it becomes exhausting. Not because moving forward is difficult, but because you are not moving forward freely. You are carrying weight that no longer belongs to your present. This weight affects how you see new relationships. You may compare without realizing it. You may hesitate to open fully. You may expect similar outcomes even when the situation is different, because part of you is still connected to what has already ended. This is how expired relationships continue to shape your experience, not through presence, but through attachment. There is also something important to understand about emotional carrying. It often feels like loyalty. It feels like you are honoring the connection by keeping it alive. That letting go would mean forgetting, that releasing would mean it did not matter. But that is not true. You can value what a relationship meant without carrying it forever. You can appreciate what was shared without keeping it active in your emotional space. Because holding on to it does not preserve it. It prolongs the attachment, and that attachment becomes the source of ongoing suffering. There is also a quiet resistance to fully letting go. A part of you that believes something might still change, that there might still be a chance for reconnection, that things could return to what they once were. And as long as that possibility remains in your mind, even faintly, it keeps the attachment alive. But the reality is, most relationships do not end without reason. Something shifted, something changed. And even if you do not fully understand why, the ending itself is a form of clarity. a signal that the connection as it once existed is no longer the same. And holding on to it does not bring it back. It only keeps you tied to a version that no longer exists. This is where letting go becomes necessary, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of release. You begin to recognize that carrying the relationship is no longer serving you, that it is not adding to your life, but quietly draining it. And with that recognition, you start to loosen your grip. Not forcefully, not suddenly, but gradually. You allow the memories to exist without engaging with them constantly. You notice when your mind returns to that person, and instead of following the thought, you gently return to the present. You stop feeding the connection with your attention, and over time, something begins to shift. The emotional intensity starts to fade, the thoughts become less frequent. The sense of connection weakens, not because the relationship did not matter, but because you are no longer sustaining it. There is also a deeper sense of clarity that emerges. You begin to see the relationship more fully. Not just the parts you held on to, but the whole picture. The reasons it ended, the ways it no longer aligned, the ways you have grown since then. And this broader perspective makes it easier to release. Because you are no longer holding on to an idealized version, you are seeing it as it was, and as it is now. Something that existed, but has completed its place in your life. This does not erase the meaning. It does not remove the impact. But it allows you to carry that meaning without carrying the attachment. And that is where the real shift happens. You are no longer emotionally tied to something that is no longer present. You are no longer influenced by a connection that has already ended. You begin to feel lighter, more open, more available to what is happening now. And this changes how you experience new relationships. You approach them without the weight of the past, without comparison, without fear rooted in what has already happened. You meet people as they are, not as reminders of what was. And this creates space for something new, not a replacement, but a different kind of connection, one that is not shaped by unresolved attachment, one that is experienced fully in the present. There is also a sense of peace that comes with this, a quiet understanding that you do not need to carry everything that has been part of your life, that some things are meant to be experienced and then released, that not every connection is meant to last forever. And that this does not make it meaningless, it simply makes it complete. And when you reach that understanding, something shifts inside you. The need to hold on fades, the emotional weight lifts, and you begin to feel more grounded in your own life, not defined by who was in it before, but by what is here now. This is the quiet freedom of releasing expired relationships, not forgetting them, not denying them, but no longer carrying them as if they are still alive. And in that release, you make space for new experiences, new connections, new ways of being, because your heart is no longer occupied by something that has already ended. It is open, present, and ready for what comes next. Let's continue. And as your heart begins to feel lighter, as you slowly stop carrying people who are no longer part of your present, something deeper begins to reveal itself. It is not always the person that is hardest to release. Sometimes it is who you were when they were there, a version of yourself that felt certain, defined, and complete in a way that now feels distant. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a kind of loss that is quiet but deeply unsettling. It does not come from someone leaving or something ending, but from a shift that happens within you. A role disappears, a title fades, a version of who you believed yourself to be no longer fits the life you are living. And suddenly, something feels unfamiliar, not outside of you, but inside. This is the moment when identity becomes the hardest thing to release. Because identity is not just how you describe yourself, it is how you understand your place in the world. It is the structure your mind uses to create meaning, direction, and certainty. It answers silent questions like, who am I? Where do I belong? What is my purpose? And when that structure begins to dissolve, it can feel like everything is becoming unclear at once. There is a subtle discomfort that appears, a sense of not knowing how to move, how to think, how to see yourself, because the version of you that once guided those things is no longer fully present. This can happen in many ways. A career ends, and with it, the identity of being successful, needed, or respected. A relationship changes, and the identity of being loved, chosen, or important begins to shift. A phase of life passes, and the identity tied to that phase no longer applies. And in each case, the external change is only part of the experience. The deeper impact is internal. It is the loss of the self you built around those things. This is why identity is so difficult to release, because it is not something you hold in your hands. It is something you feel as your sense of being. Letting go of it can feel like losing yourself, and the mind resists that strongly. It tries to hold on to the old image. It repeats familiar thoughts. It looks for ways to maintain the same sense of identity, even when the conditions that supported it have changed. This creates tension, because you are trying to live in a present reality while holding on to a past version of yourself. And the two do not fully align. This misalignment leads to confusion. You may feel disconnected from your own life. You may question your direction. You may feel like you are in between versions of yourself, no longer who you were, but not yet clear on who you are becoming. This space can feel uncomfortable, even empty. But it is also a necessary part of growth, because identity is not meant to be fixed. It evolves as you evolve. But when you cling to a past identity, you slow that evolution. You try to remain the same in a life that is asking you to change, and that creates suffering. There is also a deeper layer to this. Many identities are built not just from personal experience, but from external validation, from how others see you, from the roles you play in their lives, from the expectations that have been placed on you. And when those things shift, it can feel like your sense of worth is shifting with them, because part of your identity was tied to how you were perceived, and without that perception, something feels missing. This is why letting go of identity can feel so unsettling. It challenges not just how you see yourself, but how you believe others see you. And this can create a fear of becoming invisible, irrelevant, or undefined. But there is something important to understand here. You are not your roles. You are not your titles. You are not the image you have built around yourself. Those things are expressions of who you are, but they are not the core of your being. They change as your life changes. But something deeper remains. The challenge is that most people do not spend time connecting with that deeper part. They become so identified with their roles and external markers that when those are removed, they feel lost. But this loss is not the end. It is an opening, an opportunity to discover a sense of self that is not dependent on external conditions. A sense of self that is not tied to what you do, what you have, or how you are seen, but to something more stable, more present, more real. This is where the process of releasing identity begins to shift. It moves from something that feels like loss to something that begins to feel like discovery. You start to notice that even without the old labels, you are still here, still aware, still capable of experiencing life. And that awareness becomes a new foundation, a foundation that does not rely on fixed definitions, but on presence. There is also a sense of freedom that comes with this. When you are no longer bound to a specific identity, you become more flexible, more open to change, more willing to grow in ways that your previous identity may have limited. Because identity often creates boundaries. It tells you who you are and, by extension, who you are not. And while this can provide structure, it can also create limitation. But when you release that rigid structure, those limitations begin to dissolve. You become less concerned with fitting into a specific role, less attached to maintaining a certain image, and more open to experiencing life without needing to define it constantly. This does not mean you lose all sense of direction. It means your direction becomes more fluid, more aligned with your current experience rather than a fixed idea from the past. There is also a deeper sense of peace that emerges, because you are no longer trying to hold on to something that is naturally changing. You are allowing yourself to evolve without resistance. And in that allowance, there is less tension, less internal conflict, less pressure to be a certain way. You begin to accept that change is not a threat to your identity, it is part of it. And this acceptance creates space. Space to explore new aspects of yourself, space to grow in ways you may not have considered before, space to simply be without needing to define every part of your existence. There is also a quiet confidence that begins to form, not based on external validation, but on inner stability. A sense that no matter how your life changes, you are still grounded in something deeper. Something that does not disappear when roles change or titles fade. And this confidence changes how you move through life. You become less reactive to change, less afraid of losing what once defined you, because you know that your sense of self is not limited to those things. It is something you carry within you. And as you continue to release old identities, something new begins to take shape. Not a fixed identity, but a more flexible way of being, a way of existing that is not tied to one version of yourself, but open to continuous growth. This is where true freedom begins, not in finding a perfect identity and holding on to it forever, but in allowing yourself to change without losing your sense of self. Because your true self is not something that needs to be held on to. It is something that remains even as everything else changes. And when you begin to experience that, something shifts. You feel less attached to who you were, less concerned with who you are supposed to be, and more present with who you are right now. And in that presence there is peace. Not because everything is certain, but because you are no longer resisting the uncertainty. You are allowing yourself to move with life, rather than trying to stay the same within it. And that is where the deepest transformation begins. Let's continue, and as you begin to loosen your grip on who you thought you had to be, as identity becomes something more fluid and less fixed, another pattern begins to reveal itself. It is not only who you are that the mind tries to hold in place, it is everything. Outcomes, timelines, people, conversations, even the smallest details of how life should unfold. There is a quiet effort running beneath your awareness, constantly trying to shape reality into something predictable. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a tension that feels almost invisible at first. It does not shout. It does not demand attention, but it is always there, quietly working in the background. A need to make sure things go a certain way, a need to prepare for every possibility, a need to avoid uncertainty at all costs. This is the need for control. And at first, it feels like safety. It feels like responsibility, like awareness, like strength. Because when you are in control, nothing can surprise you, nothing can disrupt you, nothing can go wrong without your approval. But slowly, without realizing it, that sense of safety begins to turn into something else, something heavier, something exhausting. Because control is never complete. No matter how much you plan, how much you think ahead, how much you try to manage every detail, life continues to move in ways you cannot predict. And when it does, the mind reacts, it tightens, it questions, it tries harder. This is where control begins to create tension. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are trying to manage something that is not fully manageable. Life is not a system that can be controlled completely. It is a flow. And the more you try to force it into a fixed structure, the more resistance you create. This resistance shows up in subtle ways: overthinking, constant planning, a need for reassurance, a difficulty relaxing even when nothing is wrong. Because part of your mind is always scanning, always adjusting, always preparing for what might happen next. This creates a kind of internal pressure, a sense that you must stay alert at all times, that if you let your guard down, something will go wrong. And over time, this becomes exhausting. Not physically at first, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, because you are never fully at rest. There is always something to manage, always something to anticipate, always something to control. This is how the need for control quietly destroys inner peace. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. It takes away your ability to be present, because your attention is always focused on what might happen. It takes away your sense of ease, because you are always trying to maintain a certain outcome. It even affects how you experience joy, because instead of fully enjoying a moment, part of your mind is already thinking about how to preserve it or protect it from change. This creates a subtle fear, a fear of uncertainty, a fear of not knowing, a fear that if you are not in control, something will fall apart. But here is the deeper truth. Control does not remove uncertainty. It only creates the illusion that you are managing it, and maintaining that illusion requires constant effort. This is why people who seek control often feel more anxious, not less, because the more you try to control, the more aware you become of everything you cannot control. And that awareness creates tension. You begin to notice how unpredictable people are, how situations can change without warning, how outcomes do not always follow your plans. And instead of accepting that unpredictability, the mind tries to compensate. It plans more, it thinks more, it tries harder. But no matter how much effort you put in, there is always something beyond your reach. This is where the cycle continues. Control leads to tension, tension leads to more control, and the mind becomes trapped in this loop, always trying to fix something that cannot be fully fixed. There is also something deeper driving this need. Control often comes from a desire to feel secure, to avoid pain, to prevent loss, to create a sense of stability in a world that is constantly changing. But the irony is that this attempt to create security often produces the opposite. It creates instability within you, because your sense of peace becomes dependent on whether things go according to plan. And since life rarely follows a fixed plan, your peace becomes fragile, easily disturbed, easily shaken. This is why control can feel so tiring, because you are trying to hold together something that is naturally fluid. You are trying to make life predictable when it is designed to be dynamic, and that effort drains you. Not because you are weak, but because the task itself is impossible. There is also a subtle loss that happens here. When you are focused on controlling outcomes, you lose connection with the present moment. You are not fully here. You are somewhere ahead, trying to manage what has not yet happened. And because of that, you miss what is happening now. You miss the simplicity of being, the quiet moments, the small experiences that do not need to be controlled, only noticed. This is one of the hidden costs of control. It takes you out of your own life. It places you in a constant state of anticipation. And over time, that becomes your default way of existing. But there is another way, a way that does not rely on control but on trust. Not blind trust, but a grounded understanding that not everything needs to be managed for you to be okay. This does not mean you stop taking action. It does not mean you become passive. It means you recognize the difference between what you can influence and what you cannot. You act where action is possible, and you release where control is not. This creates a different kind of energy. Instead of tension, there is clarity. Instead of constant effort, there is flow. Instead of fear, there is a quiet acceptance. And in that acceptance, something begins to change. The mind becomes less reactive, less focused on controlling every detail, more open to allowing things to unfold. There is also a sense of relief that comes with this shift. A feeling that you do not have to carry everything, that you do not have to manage every outcome, that it is okay for things to happen without your constant intervention. And that relief creates space, space for calm, space for presence, space for a deeper kind of peace, a peace that does not depend on everything going your way, but on your ability to remain steady even when things do not. This is where inner peace truly begins, not in controlling life, but in releasing the need to. Because when you stop trying to control everything, you begin to experience life more fully. You respond instead of react. You adapt instead of resist. You move with life instead of against it. And in that movement, there is less friction, less struggle, less exhaustion. There is also a deeper sense of trust that develops, a trust in your ability to handle whatever comes. Not because you have planned for every possibility, but because you are present enough to respond when it happens. This kind of trust is not built through control. It is built through experience, through allowing life to unfold and seeing that you can navigate it. And as that trust grows, the need for control begins to fade. Not completely, not instantly, but gradually. You begin to notice when the mind tries to take over, when it tries to predict, manage, and control. And instead of following that pattern, you pause, you return to the present. You allow things to be as they are, and in that moment, you reclaim your peace. Because peace is not found in perfect outcomes, it is found in your relationship with uncertainty. And when that relationship changes, everything changes. You no longer feel the need to control every detail. You no longer feel threatened by unpredictability. You begin to see life not as something to be managed, but as something to be experienced. And in that experience there is a quiet freedom, a sense that you are no longer fighting against the natural flow of things, but moving with it. And that is where the deepest calm begins to settle, not because life is controlled, but because you are no longer trying to control it. Let's continue. And as the need to control begins to loosen, as the mind slowly accepts that not everything must be managed for peace to exist, something else begins to reveal itself. Life has always been moving, even when you resisted it. Changes were not random. Endings were not always accidents. Some things did not fall apart. They were being cleared, not to hurt you, but to make space. And that is where this next lesson begins. There are moments in life that feel like loss, but carry a deeper meaning that is not immediately visible. Something leaves, something ends, something is taken away, and the first reaction is confusion or pain. It feels like something important has been removed, something that once had value, something that once gave a sense of stability or direction. And the mind reacts in the only way it knows how. It questions, it resists, it tries to understand why something that once felt right is no longer present. But there is another way to see these moments, not as punishment, not as failure, but as a kind of quiet pruning, a natural process where life begins to remove what is no longer growing. There is something important to understand about growth. It does not always look like addition. Sometimes it looks like removal. In nature, a tree does not grow stronger by holding onto every branch it has ever produced. Some branches become weak. Some stop receiving nourishment. Some no longer contribute to the overall health of the tree. And when that happens, they are gradually shed. Not because they were useless, but because their time has passed. The same process happens in life. There are relationships, habits, environments, and even ways of thinking that once supported you. They had a purpose. They played a role in your development. But over time, something changes. You change. And what once aligned with you no longer does in the same way. At first, this shift is subtle. You may feel a quiet discomfort, a sense that something is no longer as fulfilling as it used to be. But the mind often ignores this. It holds on to what is familiar. It tries to maintain what has already been established. And because of that, the process of pruning becomes more noticeable. Because when something is no longer growing, life does not keep it in place indefinitely. It begins to remove it, sometimes gently, sometimes suddenly. And this is where the misunderstanding begins, because when something is removed, it feels like loss. It feels like something has been taken from you. But what if it was not taken, but released? What if it was not a sign of something going wrong, but a sign that something has completed its role? This shift in perspective changes everything. Instead of seeing loss as something negative, you begin to see it as part of a larger process. A process that is not always comfortable, but is necessary for growth. There is also a deeper layer to this. When something is no longer growing in your life, holding on to it does not bring it back to life. It only keeps you connected to something that is no longer evolving. And that connection becomes heavy. It takes energy to maintain something that is no longer naturally flowing. It requires effort to keep something alive that has already reached its end, and over time that effort becomes exhausting. This is why pruning is necessary, not to create emptiness, but to remove what is draining your energy without contributing to your growth. There is also a kind of clarity that comes with allowing this process. When you stop resisting what is being removed, you begin to see more clearly what remains. You begin to notice what is still alive, still growing, still aligned with who you are now. And that clarity allows you to invest your energy more wisely. Instead of spreading yourself across everything you have ever been connected to, you begin to focus on what is present and meaningful now. There is also a sense of trust that develops. A quiet understanding that not everything that leaves is a loss. That sometimes life is making adjustments that you cannot fully see yet. That something is being cleared to create space for something else. And this trust reduces the need to hold on tightly. It allows you to release with less resistance. Because you begin to understand that letting go is not always an act of giving up. Sometimes it is an act of allowing life to do what it naturally does, to move, to change, to refine. There is also something important about timing. Pruning does not happen randomly. It happens when something has reached a point where it is no longer contributing to growth. And while the mind may not always agree with that timing, there is often a deeper intelligence at work, a sense that something has completed its purpose, even if you are not fully ready to let it go. This is where acceptance becomes important. Not forced acceptance, but a gradual willingness to see things as they are. To recognize that holding on does not change the nature of what has already shifted, and that releasing it allows you to move forward more freely. There is also a kind of space that is created when something is removed. At first, this space can feel uncomfortable, even empty, because you were used to filling it with something that is no longer there. But this space is not meant to remain empty forever. It is an opening, a place where something new can emerge, something that aligns more closely with who you are now. But that new growth cannot happen if the old remains in place. This is why pruning is not just about removal. It is about renewal. It is about making room for something that is more aligned, more alive, more supportive of your current path. There is also a sense of lightness that comes with this process. When you are no longer carrying things that have already ended, your energy becomes more available. You feel less weighed down, less restricted, more open to new experiences. And this openness changes how you move through life. You become more responsive, less attached, more present, less focused on what has already passed. There is also a deeper sense of alignment that begins to form, because you are no longer trying to hold on to things that do not fit your current life. You are allowing your environment, your relationships, and your internal state to reflect who you are now. And this creates a kind of harmony, a sense that your life is moving in a way that feels more natural, more balanced, more true to your current self. There is also something important to understand about resistance. When you resist pruning, you create friction. You try to keep things in place that are already shifting, and that resistance creates suffering because you are working against the natural movement of life. But when you allow the process, that friction begins to dissolve. You stop fighting what is happening. You stop trying to hold everything together. And in that release, there is less struggle, less tension, less emotional weight. There is also a quiet strength that develops. A strength that comes from trusting the process of life, from understanding that not everything that leaves is meant to be kept, and that not everything that is removed is meant to be restored. This strength is not about control, it is about acceptance, about allowing things to unfold without trying to force them into a different shape. And in that allowance, there is peace, not because everything is going the way you want, but because you are no longer resisting the way things are. There is also a deeper sense of connection that emerges, not to specific outcomes or attachments, but to the flow of life itself, a sense that you are part of something that is constantly evolving, and that your role is not to control it, but to move with it, to adapt, to grow, to release when necessary, and to receive when something new appears. This creates a different kind of relationship with change, one that is not based on fear, but on understanding. A recognition that change is not always something to be avoided. Sometimes it is something to be welcomed, because it is part of the process that keeps life moving, growing, and renewing itself. And when you begin to see it this way, something shifts inside you. Loss no longer feels like the end of something valuable. It begins to feel like the completion of something that has served its purpose. And in that understanding, there is a quiet peace, a sense that even in moments of removal, something meaningful is still happening, something that may not be fully visible yet, but is part of a larger movement. And as you continue to allow this process, you begin to feel more aligned with life, less resistant, more open, more at ease with the natural cycles of growth and release, because you understand that not everything is meant to stay, and that what leaves is not always lost. Sometimes it is simply making space for what is meant to come next. Let's continue. And as you begin to trust the quiet pruning of life, as you start to see that not everything that leaves is a loss, another subtle pattern begins to reveal itself. It is not always life that holds things in place. Sometimes it is you. Not consciously, not with clear intention, but through something deeper, something that quietly resists emptiness and change. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a feeling that many people carry without questioning it, a belief that holding on is a sign of strength, that staying committed even when something is no longer working shows loyalty, that refusing to let go proves love, that enduring something long past its natural end is a mark of discipline. At first, these ideas seem admirable. They sound like virtues. They sound like the qualities of someone who is strong, dependable, and unwavering. But there is a deeper truth beneath these ideas that is often ignored. Not all holding on is strength. Sometimes it is fear. There is a part of the mind that does not like emptiness. It does not like uncertainty. It does not like the feeling of not knowing what comes next. And when something begins to fade or fall away, this part reacts quickly. It tries to keep things in place. It tells you that letting go is weakness, that giving up means failure, that releasing something means it did not matter. But this is not always true. Often it is the ego speaking, the part of you that is attached to identity, control, and familiarity, the part that wants to maintain a sense of continuity even when life is naturally changing. The ego does not like endings, because endings create space, and space feels like emptiness, and emptiness feels like a loss of control, so it creates stories. It tells you that staying is strength, that holding on is noble, that walking away is a sign of weakness. And without realizing it, you begin to believe these stories. You stay in situations that no longer support you. You hold on to relationships that have already ended in everything but name. You continue patterns that no longer align with who you are becoming, and you call it strength. But if you look closely, there is often tension beneath that strength. A quiet discomfort, a sense that something is not right, even though you are trying to convince yourself that it is. This is the difference between true strength and attachment. True strength feels steady, it feels clear. It does not require constant effort to maintain. Attachment, on the other hand, feels heavy. It requires energy to sustain. It creates inner conflict, because part of you knows that something has changed, but another part refuses to accept it. There is also something important to understand about how the ego defines value. It often measures worth based on duration. The longer you stay, the more meaningful it must be. The longer you endure, the stronger you must be. But duration does not always equal value. Something can last a long time and still no longer serve you. Something can continue out of habit, not out of alignment. And staying in it does not make it right. It simply makes it prolonged. There is also a fear of what comes after letting go. A fear that if you release something, there will be nothing to replace it. That you will be left with a kind of emptiness that feels uncomfortable or uncertain. And so you hold on, not because what you are holding is still alive, but because you are afraid of what happens if you let go. This is where attachment disguises itself as resilience. You tell yourself you are being strong, that you are pushing through, that you are not giving up. But beneath that narrative, there is often a quiet fear, a fear of facing the unknown, a fear of losing a sense of identity or stability, a fear of being without something that once defined you. And this fear keeps you in place. It keeps you holding on, even when everything around you is showing signs that it is time to release. There is also a deeper layer to this. Sometimes holding on is tied to how you see yourself. You may believe that you are the kind of person who does not quit, who stays loyal no matter what, who endures through difficulty. And while these qualities can be valuable, they can also become limiting when they are applied without awareness. Because not every situation requires endurance. Not every connection is meant to be maintained forever. And not every ending is a failure. But when your identity is tied to being someone who always holds on, letting go can feel like betraying that identity. So you continue, even when it no longer feels right. This is how the ego maintains control, not through force, but through subtle beliefs. Beliefs that feel true, but are not always aligned with reality. There is also something important about how the ego interprets letting go. It often sees it as loss, as something being taken away, as something that diminishes you. But in many cases, letting go is not about losing something valuable. It is about releasing something that is no longer aligned, something that has already completed its role, something that is no longer contributing to your growth. And holding on to it does not preserve its value. It only prevents you from moving forward. There is also a kind of exhaustion that comes from holding on. Not always immediately, but over time, because maintaining something that is no longer naturally flowing requires effort. You have to keep convincing yourself, keep justifying, keep trying to make it work. And that effort drains you, not because you are weak, but because the situation itself is no longer supported by the natural movement of life. This is why letting go can sometimes feel like relief. Not because you are giving up, but because you are no longer resisting what has already shifted. You are no longer carrying something that has already ended. And in that release, there is a lightness, a sense that you are no longer holding tension inside you. There is also clarity that comes with letting go. When you are no longer trying to maintain something, you begin to see it more clearly. You see what it was, what it became, and why it is no longer aligned. And this clarity allows you to move forward without confusion, without the constant back and forth of trying to decide whether to stay or leave. You simply recognize that the time has come to release. There is also a deeper form of strength that emerges here, a strength that is not about holding on, but about knowing when to let go, a strength that is not tied to endurance, but to awareness, the ability to see when something is no longer serving you and to release it without resistance. This kind of strength is quieter. It does not need to prove itself. It does not need to be seen as admirable. It simply exists as a natural response to what is real. There is also a sense of freedom that comes with this. When you are no longer bound to the idea that holding on is always the right choice, you become more flexible, more responsive to change, more aligned with what is actually happening in your life. And this flexibility allows you to grow in ways that rigid attachment cannot. Because you are no longer forcing yourself to stay the same, you are allowing yourself to evolve. There is also a shift in how you understand love and loyalty. You begin to see that love does not always mean staying. That loyalty does not always mean holding on. Sometimes love means allowing something to end. Sometimes loyalty means being true to your own growth. And this shift changes how you relate to everything. You no longer measure your strength by how much you can endure, but by how clearly you can see, how honestly you can respond, how willingly you can release what is no longer aligned. And in that willingness there is peace. Not because everything stays, but because you are no longer trying to make everything stay. You are allowing life to move, to change, to evolve, and you are moving with it, not out of weakness but out of understanding. Because true strength is not in holding on at all costs. It is in knowing when holding on becomes the very thing that keeps you stuck, and having the courage to let go. Let's continue. And as you begin to see that holding on is not always strength, as you loosen the quiet grip of the ego that once convinced you to stay past what was true, something even more delicate begins to surface. It is not just about what you are holding on to. It is about why you held it in the first place. Because some things you carry were not mistakes. They once protected you. They once helped you survive. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a kind of grief that does not come from losing something harmful, but from releasing something that once kept you safe. It is a quiet, complicated feeling, because what you are letting go of is not entirely negative. In fact, at one point, it may have been necessary. There were ways you learned to cope, to protect yourself, to navigate moments that felt overwhelming or uncertain. These ways became part of you, not because you chose them consciously, but because they worked. They gave you stability when things felt unstable. They gave you distance when something felt too painful. They gave you control when life felt unpredictable. And because of that, you trusted them, you relied on them, you built patterns around them. But over time, something begins to change. What once protected you starts to limit you. What once helped you cope begins to keep you from fully living. And this is where the tension begins, because part of you recognizes that something is no longer working, but another part remembers how much it once helped. And letting go of it does not feel simple. It feels like you are giving up something that once saved you. There is a natural resistance here, a hesitation, because even if the pattern no longer serves you, it still feels familiar. And familiarity creates a sense of safety, even if that safety is no longer real. This is why letting go of old coping mechanisms can feel unsettling, not because they are still necessary, but because they are known. They are predictable. They have been part of your life for so long that releasing them feels like stepping into the unknown. There is also a deeper layer to this. Many coping mechanisms are not just behaviors. They are emotional strategies, ways of avoiding pain, ways of managing discomfort, ways of protecting the heart from being overwhelmed. And when you begin to let go of them, you are not just changing what you do, you are changing how you relate to your own emotions. This can feel vulnerable, because without those protective layers, you begin to feel things more directly, more clearly, more fully, and at first that can feel intense. But it is also where growth begins, because avoiding emotion does not remove it. It only delays it. It keeps it beneath the surface, where it continues to influence you in subtle ways. But when you begin to face it without the usual defenses, something shifts. You start to understand your experience more deeply. You begin to see what you were protecting yourself from, and in that understanding there is healing. There is also something important about acknowledging the role these patterns played. They were not wrong. They were not failures. They were responses, adaptations to situations that required them. And recognizing this allows you to release them with compassion rather than judgment, because you are not letting go of something bad. You are letting go of something that has completed its purpose. This changes the emotional tone of the process. Instead of feeling like you are losing something, it begins to feel like you are outgrowing it. And there is a quiet dignity in that. There is also a sense of gratitude that can emerge, a recognition that these patterns helped you reach this point, that they carried you through moments that were difficult, and that without them, you may not be where you are now. But gratitude does not mean holding on forever. It means acknowledging the role something played, and then allowing it to rest. There is also a fear that often appears during this process. A fear that without these coping mechanisms, you will not be able to handle what comes next, that you will feel too much, that you will not be as strong. But this fear is often based on an old version of you, a version that needed those protections. And while that was true then, it may not be true now. You have grown, you have changed, you have developed new ways of understanding and responding. And part of that growth involves trusting that you can face life without relying on the same strategies. This trust does not appear instantly. It builds gradually, through experience, through small moments where you choose a different response, where you allow yourself to feel without shutting down, where you stay present instead of avoiding. And each time you do this, something strengthens within you, not the old kind of strength based on control or avoidance, but a quieter, deeper strength, the ability to be with what is, without needing to escape it. There is also a shift in how you see discomfort. Instead of something to be avoided, it becomes something to be understood, a signal, a message, an invitation to look more closely at what is happening within you, and this changes your relationship with your own experience. You become less reactive, less driven by the need to protect yourself at all costs, and more open to learning from what you feel. There is also a sense of space that begins to open up. When you are no longer relying on old coping mechanisms, you create room for new ways of being, new ways of responding, new ways of connecting with yourself and others. And this space is where transformation happens, not all at once but gradually, as you explore different ways of engaging with life. There is also a kind of clarity that emerges. You begin to see how certain patterns were shaping your experience, how they were influencing your thoughts, your emotions, your decisions. And with that awareness, you gain the ability to choose differently, not from habit, but from understanding. There is also a deeper sense of authenticity that develops, because you are no longer filtering your experience through old defenses. You are meeting life more directly, more honestly. And this honesty creates a stronger connection with yourself, a sense that you are no longer hiding behind patterns, but showing up as you are. There is also a quiet grief that remains. Even as you grow, even as you change, there is still a part of you that remembers what those patterns provided. And letting go of them can feel like saying goodbye to a version of yourself. A version that needed protection, that needed support, that did the best it could with what it had. And honoring that version is important, not as something to return to, but as something to recognize, because it is part of your story, part of your journey. And releasing it does not erase it. It simply allows you to move beyond it. There is also a sense of maturity that comes with this process, a recognition that growth is not just about gaining new things, but about releasing what is no longer needed, and that this release is not always easy, but it is necessary, because holding on to old protections can prevent new possibilities, new connections, new ways of experiencing life. And as you continue to let go, something shifts within you. You begin to feel more present, more open, more capable of engaging with life as it is, rather than through the lens of past experiences. And in that openness, there is a new kind of safety, not based on control or avoidance, but on trust. Trust in your ability to navigate whatever comes. Trust in your capacity to feel, to respond, to grow. And this trust creates a different foundation, one that is not dependent on old patterns, but on your evolving awareness. There is also a quiet strength that becomes more stable, a strength that does not need to defend itself, that does not rely on avoidance, but that comes from being fully present with your experience. And this presence changes everything. It allows you to move through life with more ease, more clarity, more alignment with who you are becoming, because you are no longer held back by patterns that once protected you, but now limit you. You are free to grow, free to change, free to experience life without the filters that once shaped your responses. And in that freedom, there is peace. Not because everything is easy, but because you are no longer resisting your own evolution. You are allowing yourself to become. And that is where true transformation begins. Let's continue. And as you begin to release what once protected you, as you slowly loosen your attachment to patterns that once felt like safety, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. It is not always the pain itself that keeps you stuck. Sometimes it is the familiarity of that pain, a strange comfort in what you already know, even when it hurts. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a quiet pull inside the human mind that seeks what is familiar, not what is best, not what is healthy, but what is known. Something can be painful, limiting, even destructive, and yet still feel comfortable simply because it is recognizable. It carries a pattern you understand, a rhythm you have learned to navigate, a language your emotions have become fluent in, and because of that, it feels safer than the unknown. This is how emotional familiarity begins to shape your life in ways that are not always obvious. You may find yourself drawn to the same kinds of relationships, even when they bring discomfort. You may repeat the same emotional cycles, even when you are aware that they are not serving you. You may stay in environments that limit you, not because they are good for you, but because they feel predictable. And beneath all of this, there is a simple truth. The mind chooses familiarity over uncertainty, even when familiarity brings pain. There is a reason for this. The unknown requires openness. It requires vulnerability. It asks you to step into something that has no guarantees, and for the mind, that feels like a risk. So it turns back to what it knows, even if what it knows is chaos, even if what it knows is emotional instability, even if what it knows is a pattern that quietly drains you, because at least within that pattern, there is a sense of control. You know what to expect. You know how to respond. You know how the cycle unfolds, and that predictability creates a kind of comfort. But this comfort comes at a cost. It becomes a cage, not one that is forced upon you, but one that is built slowly through repetition and attachment. A cage that feels safe because it is familiar, even though it limits your growth. This is where suffering deepens. Not because you are unaware of the pain, but because you continue to return to it, not consciously choosing it, but being drawn to it through habit, through emotional memory, through the subtle belief that this is what life feels like. There is also something deeper happening beneath this pattern. Familiarity often becomes tied to identity. You begin to associate certain emotional states with who you are. If you have spent a long time in environments that were unstable, calm may feel uncomfortable. If you have experienced relationships filled with tension, peace may feel unfamiliar, and because it feels unfamiliar, it may also feel unsafe. This creates a strange reversal, where what is healthy feels uncertain and what is harmful feels normal. And within this reversal, the mind begins to cling to what it knows, even if it knows it is painful. There is also a subtle form of attachment that develops here, an attachment not just to people or situations, but to emotional experiences themselves. You become accustomed to certain feelings, certain patterns of interaction, certain ways of relating to yourself and others. And over time, these patterns begin to feel like home, even if they are not supportive, even if they limit your ability to grow. This is why breaking free from emotional familiarity can feel so difficult. It is not just about changing external circumstances. It is about shifting internal patterns, letting go of ways of feeling that have become deeply ingrained, and stepping into something that feels new, uncertain, and at times uncomfortable. There is also a fear that arises during this process, a fear that if you leave what is familiar, you may lose your sense of stability. That even if what you are leaving is not ideal, it still provides a kind of structure, and without it, you may feel lost. But this fear is often a reflection of the mind's attachment to what it knows, not a reflection of what is actually possible. Because beyond that familiarity, there is space for something different, something that may not feel immediately comfortable, but is more aligned with your well-being. This is where awareness becomes important, the ability to recognize when you are choosing familiarity over growth. When you are staying in a pattern not because it serves you, but because it is known. And this recognition creates a choice. A moment where you can pause and see what is happening rather than simply repeating it. There is also a shift in how you begin to understand comfort. You start to see that not all comfort is beneficial. That some forms of comfort are simply the absence of change. And that true growth often requires stepping outside of that comfort, into something that may feel uncertain at first, but carries the potential for transformation. This does not mean forcing yourself into discomfort. It means being willing to experience new emotional states without immediately retreating to what is familiar. Allowing yourself to sit with the unknown, to explore new ways of relating, new ways of feeling, new ways of being. And over time, these new experiences begin to feel more natural, more stable, more aligned with your growth. There is also a sense of expansion that comes with this shift. When you are no longer confined to familiar patterns, your experience of life becomes broader. You begin to see possibilities that were not visible before. You begin to engage with people and situations in new ways. And this creates a sense of movement, a feeling that you are no longer repeating the same cycles, but evolving beyond them. There is also a deeper sense of freedom, not just from specific situations, but from the need to stay within what is known. You become more comfortable with uncertainty, more open to change, more willing to explore life without needing it to fit into familiar patterns. And this openness changes how you experience everything. You are no longer limited by the past. You are no longer defined by what you have always known. You are free to create new experiences, new connections, new ways of understanding yourself and the world around you. There is also a quiet courage that develops here. The courage to step away from what feels safe but limiting. The courage to face the unknown without needing immediate answers. The courage to trust that something better can exist, even if you cannot fully see it yet. And this courage becomes a guiding force, not pushing you aggressively, but gently encouraging you to move beyond what is familiar, to explore new possibilities, to allow yourself to grow. There is also a shift in how you relate to your own patterns. Instead of judging them, you begin to understand them, to see why they developed, what they provided, and why they are no longer necessary. This understanding creates compassion, a sense that you are not flawed for having these patterns, but human, and that releasing them is not about fixing something broken, but about allowing something new to emerge. There is also a sense of renewal that comes with this process. As you let go of familiar pain, you create space for unfamiliar peace, a kind of calm that may feel strange at first, but gradually becomes more natural, a kind of connection that is not based on old patterns, but on present awareness. And this renewal changes how you see yourself. You are no longer someone who is defined by past experiences. You are someone who is capable of change, capable of growth, capable of stepping into something new. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges. That familiarity is not always a guide to what is right, that what feels comfortable is not always what is best, and that growth often requires moving beyond what you already know. This understanding allows you to make different choices, not based on habit, but on awareness, not based on fear, but on possibility. And in those choices, something begins to shift. You begin to create a life that is not built on repetition, but on intention. A life that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you have been. And this is where the real transformation happens, not in a single moment, but in the gradual release of what is familiar and limiting, and the steady movement toward what is new and expansive. Because when you stop worshipping emotional familiarity, you begin to see that the cage was never locked, it was only known. And once you step beyond it, you realize that freedom was always available. You only needed to be willing to leave what you understood behind. Let's continue. And as you begin to step beyond the patterns that once felt safe, as you slowly loosen your attachment to what is familiar but limiting, something quieter begins to emerge. It is not just about leaving what hurts. It is about releasing the need to hold anything at all. Because beneath every attachment, every pattern, every effort to keep something close, there is a deeper habit, the habit of grasping. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a kind of tension that lives in the act of holding. It is not always visible, but it is always present. The moment the mind decides something must be kept, protected, or preserved, a subtle weight begins to form. It may be a person, a role, an outcome, or even a feeling. Once it becomes something you believe you need to hold on to, it begins to take up space inside you. This is how attachment quietly builds, not through dramatic moments, but through small decisions to keep, to cling, to not let go. And over time, your hands become full, not physically, but emotionally, full of expectations, full of identities, full of memories and desires that you continue to carry forward. At first, this fullness can feel meaningful. It can feel like you are building a life, collecting experiences, creating something solid, but slowly something begins to shift. The more you hold, the heavier it becomes. The more you try to possess, the more you feel the pressure of maintaining it. Because everything that is held must be protected. Everything that is possessed must be preserved. And that creates tension. There is a constant awareness that what you hold can be lost, that what you have can change, that what you rely on is not permanent. And this awareness, even if subtle, creates a kind of unease, a quiet fear that something may slip away. This is why holding can never bring complete peace, because peace cannot exist where there is constant effort to maintain. There is always something to guard, something to worry about, something to keep in place. And that effort keeps the mind active, restless, unable to fully settle. There is also something important about how the mind interprets possession. It often believes that having more will create stability, that if you can gather enough, hold enough, secure enough, you will finally feel at ease. But this is an illusion, because the more you gather, the more there is to lose. And the more there is to lose, the more the mind tries to control. This creates a cycle. Holding leads to fear. Fear leads to more holding. And the cycle continues until something begins to break it. And that break often comes through loss, through moments where something you were holding is no longer there. At first, this feels painful. It feels like something has been taken, like something important has been removed. But if you look deeper, there is also something else happening. There is space, a space that was not there before, a space that feels unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, but also lighter, because something is no longer being carried. This is where the lesson of empty hands begins to reveal itself. Empty hands are not a sign of lack. They are a sign of release, a sign that you are no longer trying to hold everything together, a sign that you are allowing things to come and go without clinging to them. And in that release, something begins to change. The mind becomes quieter, less focused on maintaining, less driven by the need to secure, more open to experiencing life as it unfolds. There is also a deeper sense of freedom that emerges, because when your hands are empty, you are not tied to what you are holding. You are not limited by it. You are not defined by it. You are free to move, free to receive, free to experience without the weight of constant attachment. There is also a shift in how you relate to life. Instead of trying to possess, you begin to appreciate. Instead of trying to keep, you begin to experience. And this changes everything. Because appreciation does not create attachment. It allows you to engage fully, without needing to control. It allows you to value something while it is present, without fearing its absence. This creates a different kind of peace, a peace that is not dependent on things staying the same, but on your ability to remain steady as things change. There is also a sense of lightness that comes with this, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer carrying unnecessary weight. You are no longer holding on to every experience, every identity, every expectation. You are allowing things to pass through you rather than accumulate within you. And this lightness affects how you feel, how you think, how you move through the world. There is less resistance, less tension, less effort. There is also a deeper clarity that emerges. When you are not focused on holding everything, you begin to see more clearly what truly matters, not in terms of possession, but in terms of presence. You begin to recognize that what is meaningful is not what you can keep, but what you can fully experience. And this recognition shifts your priorities. You become less concerned with accumulation, less driven by the need to secure, more focused on being present with what is here now. There is also a kind of trust that develops. A trust that you do not need to hold on to everything to be okay. That life can move, change and evolve without taking something essential from you. Because what is essential is not what you hold, it is what you are. And that does not depend on external conditions. This trust allows you to release more easily, not because you are forcing yourself to let go, but because you no longer feel the need to hold on so tightly. There is also a deeper connection to the present moment. When your hands are empty, your attention is not divided. It is not pulled into maintaining what you have. It is available, open, responsive. And this presence creates a different experience of life, one that is more direct, more immediate, more alive. There is also a sense of humility that comes with this, a recognition that you do not control everything, that life is not something to be possessed, but something to be participated in. And this humility brings a kind of peace, because you are no longer trying to manage everything. You are allowing yourself to be part of something larger, something that moves beyond your control. There is also a quiet joy that begins to appear, Not the kind that comes from gaining or achieving, but the kind that comes from being unburdened, from not carrying more than you need, from not trying to hold on to what is naturally changing. And this joy is subtle but steady. It does not depend on circumstances. It arises from the absence of tension, from the release of constant grasping. There is also a deeper understanding that develops, that emptiness is not something to fear. It is not a void that must be filled. It is a space where new experiences can enter, where new insights can arise, where life can move freely. And when you begin to see emptiness this way, your relationship with it changes. You no longer resist it. You no longer try to fill it immediately. You allow it. And in that allowance, something opens. There is more room for clarity, more room for peace, more room for a lighter way of being. There is also a shift in how you see freedom. It is no longer about having everything. It is about needing less, about being able to move through life without being weighed down by constant attachment. And this kind of freedom is not dependent on external conditions. It is something you carry within you, a way of being that is not tied to what you hold, but to how you relate to what comes and goes. There is also a quiet transformation that happens. As you continue to release, as you continue to allow your hands to remain empty, your sense of self begins to change. You are no longer defined by what you possess. You are no longer shaped by what you try to keep. You become more fluid, more open, more aligned with the natural flow of life. And in that alignment, there is peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer resisting the impermanence of everything. You are allowing it, living within it, moving with it. And that is where the deepest calm begins to settle. A calm that does not come from holding everything together, but from letting things be as they are. A calm that arises when your hands are no longer full and your soul is no longer heavy. A calm that quietly reminds you that freedom was never about having more. It was always about holding less. Let's continue. And as your hands begin to empty, as you slowly release the need to hold, possess, and secure, something even more fragile begins to reveal itself. It is not always things you are holding. Sometimes it is a silent longing, a quiet desire to remain somewhere you no longer are, to still matter in a place that has already moved on. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a kind of pain that does not come from what is happening now, but from what is no longer happening. A feeling that lingers quietly, often unnoticed at first, but deeply present beneath the surface. It is the desire to still be remembered, to still be chosen, to still be someone who matters in another person's life in the same way you once did. This desire is not loud. It does not always express itself directly, but it shapes thoughts, emotions, and reactions in subtle ways. You may find yourself wondering if someone still thinks about you, if your absence is noticed, if the connection you once shared still lives somewhere in their memory. And when those answers are unclear or absent, something begins to ache, because part of you is still holding on to a place in their story. Even if that story has already changed, there is something deeply human about wanting to matter, to feel seen, valued, and remembered, to know that your presence left an imprint that does not easily fade. But when this desire becomes attachment, it creates suffering, because it places your sense of worth in something you cannot control. You cannot control how someone remembers you. You cannot control whether they choose you again. You cannot control the role you play in their life moving forward. And when your peace depends on those things, it becomes unstable. It begins to rise and fall based on something outside of you. This is where the quiet hunger forms. A need to remain significant in someone else's world, to not be forgotten, to not be replaced, to not become a closed chapter. And this hunger can be painful, because life does not always keep people in the same place. connections change, people grow, paths separate, and the role you once held in someone's life may no longer be the same. But the mind often resists this. It holds onto the version of the relationship that once existed. It replays moments, it revisits memories, it tries to maintain a sense of connection, even when that connection is no longer present in the same way. This is how attachment to being remembered begins to form, not through the present, but through the past, through what was rather than what is. There is also a deeper layer to this. Wanting to be remembered is often tied to identity, to the sense of who you were in that person's life, the role you played, the meaning you held. And when that role changes or disappears, it can feel like losing a part of yourself, because you are no longer seen in the same way, no longer needed in the same way, no longer chosen in the same way, and that shift can create a sense of emptiness, a feeling that something important has been taken away. But what is often overlooked is that your value does not come from being central in someone else's story. It does not depend on being remembered in a certain way. It is not defined by whether someone chooses you again. These things may feel meaningful, but they are not the source of your worth. When you begin to rely on them, you create a kind of dependency, a need for external validation to feel complete. And that need keeps you tied to something that is no longer within your control. There is also a subtle form of waiting that can develop here. Waiting to be noticed again, waiting to be reached out to, waiting for some sign that you still matter in the same way. And this waiting keeps you in the past. It keeps your attention focused on something that is no longer active in your present. And because of that, it limits your ability to fully engage with what is here now. There is also a kind of comparison that can arise. You may wonder who has taken your place, how they are being treated, whether they are receiving the same attention or care that you once did. And this comparison creates further discomfort, because it reinforces the idea that your value is tied to your position in someone else's life. But this perspective is limited, because relationships are not fixed positions, they are dynamic. They change based on time, circumstance, and personal growth. And trying to hold on to a specific role within them creates tension, because you are trying to maintain something that is naturally evolving. There is also something important to understand about memory. People do remember, but not always in the way you expect, not always with the same intensity, not always with the same meaning. And this is not a reflection of your value. It is simply the nature of human experience. People move forward. They create new memories. They shift their focus. And while the past remains, it does not always remain central. And accepting this can be difficult, because it challenges the desire to remain significant, but it also creates freedom. Because when you release the need to be remembered in a specific way, you free yourself from that dependency. You no longer need someone else's memory to validate your experience. You no longer need to be chosen again to feel worthy. You begin to find a sense of completeness within yourself. There is also a shift in how you relate to the past. Instead of holding on to it as something that defines your present, you begin to see it as something that contributed to your growth, something that was meaningful but is no longer active. And this allows you to appreciate it without being attached to it. There is also a deeper sense of presence that emerges. When you are no longer focused on whether someone remembers you, your attention returns to your own life, to what is happening now, to what you are experiencing, creating, and becoming. And this shift changes everything, because your energy is no longer tied to something outside of you. It is available, free to move forward, free to engage with new experiences. There is also a quiet strength that develops, a strength that comes from not needing to be chosen to feel complete, from not needing to be central in someone else's life to feel significant. This strength is not loud, it does not seek validation, it simply exists as a stable sense of self. And this stability allows you to move through relationships with more ease, with less attachment, with less fear of being forgotten or replaced, because you are no longer defining yourself through those dynamics. There is also a sense of peace that comes with this release. A feeling that you are no longer holding on to something that cannot be controlled, that you are no longer waiting for something that may not come, that you are no longer tied to a role that has already changed. And in that release, there is lightness, a sense that you are free to move forward without carrying the weight of needing to remain in someone else's story. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges, that you can matter without being central, that you can have meaning without being remembered constantly, that your existence is not dependent on how others hold you in their minds. And this understanding shifts your perspective. You begin to see that your life is your own, that your value is inherent, that your experience is valid regardless of how it is remembered by others. There is also a quiet acceptance that forms, a recognition that not all connections are meant to remain the same, that not all stories continue in the way you expect, and that this is not a loss of value, but a natural part of life. And with that acceptance, something softens, the need to hold on, the need to be remembered, the need to be chosen again. They begin to fade, not because they were wrong, but because they are no longer necessary, and in their place, something else begins to grow, a sense of self that is not dependent on external validation, a sense of peace that is not tied to someone else's attention, a sense of freedom that comes from letting go of the need to remain where you no longer are. And this is where true healing begins. Not in being remembered, but in remembering yourself. Not in being chosen, but in choosing your own path. Not in being returned to, but in moving forward without needing to go back. And in that movement, there is a quiet power, a power that does not rely on others, a power that comes from within. And that is where your peace begins to settle. And as you begin to release the quiet need to be remembered, chosen, or returned to, something deeper begins to surface. It is not always the ending itself that creates the deepest pain. Sometimes it is the resistance to that ending, a refusal to accept what has already shifted, a silent struggle to keep something alive, even when it has already come to its natural close. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a moment in every ending where the truth becomes clear. Something has changed. Something is no longer what it was. A connection has weakened, a chapter has closed, a path has quietly come to its end. And in that moment, there are two directions the mind can take. One is acceptance, the other is resistance. Acceptance does not mean agreement. It does not mean the ending feels good or easy. It simply means you are willing to see what is real without trying to rewrite it. Resistance, on the other hand, is the attempt to hold on to what is already leaving. It is the effort to reverse what has already unfolded. It is the quiet voice that says this should not be happening, even when it already has. And this resistance is where suffering begins to multiply, because the ending itself may be brief, but the refusal to accept it can last much longer. There is a kind of inner conflict that forms when you resist an ending. Part of you knows something is over, but another part refuses to let go. And this split creates tension, a constant pull between what is real and what you wish were still true. This tension does not stay contained. It begins to spread into other areas of your life. It affects your thoughts, your emotions, your ability to rest, because your mind is not settled. It is caught in a loop, trying to resolve something that has already been decided by life. This is how one ending can create many smaller endings within you. Your sleep becomes disturbed. Not always dramatically, but subtly. Your mind replays conversations, revisits moments, searches for explanations, and even when your body is tired, your mind remains active, because it is still trying to hold on to something that has already moved on. There is also a shift in how you trust. When you resist an ending, you often begin to question everything around it. You question what was real, what was true, what you missed, what you could have done differently. And this questioning can begin to affect how you see other situations, other relationships, other possibilities, because your trust has been shaken, not just by the ending, but by your resistance to understanding it. There is also an impact on your sense of self-worth. When something ends, especially something meaningful, it is natural to reflect on your role in it. But when you resist the ending, this reflection can turn into self-blame. A belief that if you had done something differently, the outcome would have changed. And this belief keeps you tied to the past. It keeps you focused on what cannot be undone, and over time, it begins to affect how you see yourself. Not based on who you are, but based on what you believe you lost. There is also a loss of energy that happens here. Holding on to something that has already ended requires effort. You have to keep thinking about it, keep revisiting it, keep engaging with it mentally and emotionally. And this takes energy. Energy that could be used for your present life, for new experiences, for growth, but instead it is being used to maintain a connection to something that is no longer active. This creates a sense of fatigue, not always physical but emotional, a feeling of being drained without fully understanding why, because part of your energy is still invested in something that has already passed. There is also an effect on your emotional stability. When you resist an ending, your emotions can become unpredictable. You may feel moments of acceptance, followed by sudden waves of sadness or frustration. Moments of clarity, followed by confusion. Because your mind has not fully settled into the reality of the situation, it is still moving back and forth between what is and what was. And this creates instability, a sense that your emotions are not grounded, that they are being pulled in different directions. There is also a subtle isolation that can develop, not because you are physically alone, but because your attention is focused inward on something that others may not fully understand. You may find it difficult to fully engage with people around you, to be present in conversations, to connect in the way you once did, because part of you is still occupied, still processing, still holding on to something that has not been released. This is how resistance creates more endings within you. It does not just affect the original situation. It begins to influence other parts of your life, your rest, your trust, your energy, your sense of self. All become affected by the effort to hold on to what has already ended. There is also a deeper layer to this. Resistance often comes from the belief that accepting an ending means losing something important, that if you let go, it will mean it did not matter, that it will erase the significance of what you experienced. But this is not true. Acceptance does not erase meaning. It allows it to settle, to become part of your understanding rather than something you are constantly trying to hold on to. There is also a shift that happens when you begin to accept an ending. The inner conflict begins to dissolve. The tension between what is and what you wish were begins to soften, because you are no longer trying to force reality into a different shape. You are allowing it to be what it is, and in that allowance, there is peace. Not immediate, not complete, but gradual. A quiet easing of the mind, a sense that you are no longer fighting something that cannot be changed. There is also a restoration of energy. When you stop investing in resistance, that energy becomes available again. Available for your present life, for your growth, for new experiences. And this shift can feel subtle at first, but over time, it becomes more noticeable. You feel lighter, more focused, more engaged with what is happening now. There is also a rebuilding of trust, not necessarily in others, but in life itself. A recognition that endings are not always something to be feared or resisted, that they are part of the natural movement of life, and that you can navigate them without losing yourself. This trust allows you to approach future experiences with more openness, less guarded, less afraid of change, because you understand that even if something ends, you can move through it. There is also a deeper sense of self-worth that begins to form, not based on what continues, but based on your ability to remain steady through change, to accept what is, to release what has ended, and to continue moving forward. And this kind of self-worth is more stable because it is not dependent on external circumstances. It is rooted in your relationship with yourself. There is also a sense of emotional balance that returns. As the mind settles, as the resistance fades, your emotions become more stable, less reactive, more grounded, because they are no longer being pulled between past and present. They are aligned with what is happening now. There is also a quiet clarity that emerges, a clearer understanding of what the ending meant, what it taught you, how it shaped you. And this clarity allows you to integrate the experience, to carry its meaning without carrying its weight. There is also a deeper acceptance of impermanence, a recognition that everything changes, that not everything is meant to last, and that this does not make it any less meaningful. It simply makes it part of the natural cycle of life. And with this acceptance, something shifts. The need to resist endings begins to fade. Not because you no longer care, but because you understand. You understand that holding on does not prevent endings. It only prolongs the pain of them. And in that understanding, there is a quiet release, a willingness to let things end when they have reached their natural conclusion, a willingness to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. And that is where your peace begins to return. Not because endings stop happening, but because you are no longer resisting them. You are allowing them, moving with them, and in that movement you remain whole. And as you begin to accept endings without resistance, as you slowly allow life to close what has already completed its time, another quiet truth begins to surface. It is not only the ending itself that creates suffering. Sometimes it is the story you built around the person before the ending ever came. A role you gave them, a place you assigned them in your life. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a subtle way the mind relates to people. It does not always see them as they are. Instead, it sees them through meaning, through expectation, through quiet narratives that begin forming from the very first moments of connection. Someone is not just a person, they become something, a source of comfort, a sense of direction, a symbol of the future, a solution to loneliness, a reflection of who you believe you are or hope to become. And without realizing it, you begin to give them a role, not something spoken out loud, but something deeply felt. They become the one who understands you, the one who will stay, the one who will support you in ways others have not, the one who completes a part of your life that once felt uncertain. And once this role is formed, something begins to change. You are no longer relating to the person as they are. You are relating to the role they represent. This is where suffering quietly begins, because roles are fixed, but people are not. People change, they grow, they respond to life in ways that are not always aligned with the role you gave them. And when that happens, there is tension, not always because the person has done something wrong, but because they are no longer matching the image your mind created. This creates confusion. You may feel hurt, even when there is no clear reason. You may feel disappointed, even when expectations were never fully expressed. Because part of you is responding to the loss of the role, not just the actions of the person. There is also a subtle pressure that forms when someone is given a role. Even if they are not aware of it, they can feel it. A sense that they are expected to be a certain way. to act in a certain manner, to fulfill something that goes beyond who they naturally are. And this pressure can create distance, because no one can fully live up to a role that was created in someone else's mind. Not consistently, not perfectly. And when they begin to fall out of that role, the connection starts to shift. This is where compassion becomes important, not just for the other person, but for yourself. Because the roles you assign are often created from your own needs, your own desires for stability, understanding, connection, or meaning. And these needs are not wrong. But when they are projected onto someone else as a fixed role, they create attachment. And that attachment leads to suffering when the reality does not match the expectation. There is also a deeper layer to this. Sometimes the roles you assign are tied to your sense of identity. If someone is your source of validation, losing that role can feel like losing your sense of worth. If someone is your vision of the future, their absence can feel like losing direction. And because of this, you may hold on to the role even when the person is no longer able to fulfill it. You may try to remind them of who they used to be, try to recreate the connection as it once was, try to hold them in a place they have already moved beyond. But this creates tension, because you are asking them to remain in a version of themselves that may no longer exist. And this is not fair to them, and it is not peaceful for you. This is where the compassion of release begins. It is the ability to see the person beyond the role you gave them, to recognize that they are not here to fulfill your expectations, that they have their own path, their own changes, their own growth, and allowing them to be that, even if it means they no longer fit into your life in the same way. There is also a release that happens within you. When you let go of the role, you also let go of the attachment tied to it, the need for them to be a certain way, the need for the connection to remain the same. And this creates space to see things more clearly, to understand the relationship as it is now, not as it once was or as you hoped it would be. There is also a sense of honesty that comes with this, an acceptance that the connection has changed, that the person is no longer what you imagined them to be, and that this is not necessarily a failure, but a natural part of life, because people are not fixed, they evolve, and relationships evolve with them. There is also a shift in how you experience disappointment. Instead of seeing it as something that comes from others, you begin to see how it is often tied to your own expectations, to the roles you created, and this awareness allows you to release that disappointment more easily, because you are no longer holding on to something that was never fully real. There is also a deeper sense of respect that develops, respect for the other person's individuality, for their right to change, to grow, to move in directions that may not include you in the same way. And this respect creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on roles but on presence, on meeting each other as you are, without the need to fulfill predefined expectations. There is also a quiet freedom that comes with this. When you stop assigning roles, you stop trying to control how others show up in your life. You allow them to be who they are, and in doing so, you free yourself from the constant tension of expectation. There is also a shift in how you relate to future connections. You become more aware of the tendency to assign roles, more conscious of how your mind creates meaning and expectation. And this awareness allows you to engage more openly, more flexibly, without needing to define everything immediately. This creates more authentic relationships, connections that are not burdened by unspoken roles, but allowed to evolve naturally. There is also a sense of lightness that comes from this, because you are no longer carrying the weight of expectation. You are no longer trying to maintain a specific version of someone. You are simply experiencing them as they are, and this makes interactions more fluid, more real, less constrained. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges, that people are not here to complete you, define you, or fulfill every need. They are part of your experience, not the foundation of your identity. And this understanding shifts how you see connection. It becomes something that adds to your life, not something that determines it. There is also a quiet peace that forms, a peace that comes from allowing things to be as they are, from not forcing people into roles they cannot sustain, from not holding on to versions of them that no longer exist. And in that peace, there is less conflict, less disappointment, less emotional strain. There is also a sense of maturity that develops, a recognition that relationships are dynamic, that they change, evolve, and sometimes end, and that this is not something to resist, but something to understand. There is also a deeper compassion for yourself, because you begin to see why you created those roles, what you were seeking, what you were hoping to find, and instead of judging yourself for it, you begin to understand it, to see it as part of your growth. There is also a quiet transformation that takes place. As you release the roles, you begin to relate to people more directly, more honestly, without the layers of expectation that once shaped your perception. And this creates a more genuine experience of connection, one that is not based on what you want someone to be, but on who they actually are. There is also a sense of alignment that returns, because you are no longer holding on to something that does not fit. You are allowing your relationships to reflect your current reality, your current understanding, your current growth. And this alignment creates a sense of ease, a feeling that you are no longer forcing things to be a certain way, but allowing them to unfold naturally. And in that unfolding, there is peace, not because everything stays the same, but because you are no longer trying to make it stay. You are allowing people to be who they are and allowing yourself to move forward without holding on to roles that no longer exist. And that is where the deepest compassion lies, not in keeping someone where they once were, but in allowing them to become who they are, and allowing yourself to do the same. And as you begin to release people from the roles your mind once gave them, another deeper truth begins to appear. Sometimes, what leaves your life is not only taking an attachment with it. It is taking an illusion, a version of yourself that could only survive as long as that thing remained. And that is where this next lesson begins. There are losses that seem, at first, to be only about the outside. A person leaves, a title disappears, a dream collapses, a season ends. The mind naturally focuses on what is gone, on the visible change, on the emptiness left behind. But some losses are doing more than removing something external. They are exposing something internal. They are revealing how much of your identity was built on what could never truly last. This is why certain losses feel deeper than expected. It is not only that something ended, it is that part of the self you had been living from begins to crack with it. A version of you that needed that relationship to feel worthy. A version of you that needed that success to feel important. A version of you that needed that role, that future, that image, that certainty to feel real. And when life removes the thing, it also shakes the self that was built around it. This is painful because the false self does not disappear quietly. It resists, it panics, it tells you that what is leaving must be saved. It tells you that if this goes, you will become nothing. It tells you that your life is falling apart, when in truth, something less visible may simply be falling away. The false self is not evil. It is not some dramatic enemy hiding inside you. It is simply the collection of illusions you became attached to over time. The stories, images, defenses, and identities that helped you feel stable in an unstable world. It is the self that says, I am only valuable if I am admired. It is the self that says, I am only safe if I am in control. It is the self that says, I am only lovable if this person stays. It is the self that says, I am only complete if life looks the way I expected. These ideas may not always speak clearly, but they shape the emotional structure of your life. And when loss arrives, it reveals them. That is why some endings feel so brutal. They are not only taking away what you loved, they are confronting what you believed about yourself. They are showing you where you placed your identity. They are showing you where illusion became attachment. They are showing you where the ego quietly built a throne and called it truth. This is one of the rarest lessons in Buddhist wisdom. Some things must leave, not because life is cruel, but because illusion cannot die while it is still being fed. As long as the attachment remains, the false self remains protected. As long as the image stays intact, the deeper truth stays hidden. As long as you can keep pretending through external support, you never have to meet what is underneath. And so life, in its own mysterious compassion, sometimes removes what your illusion depends on, not to destroy you, but to uncover you. This is why spiritual growth often feels like loss before it feels like freedom, because the false self experiences truth as death. It does not want to be exposed. It does not want to loosen its grip. It does not want to admit that what it built was fragile. So when life removes the person, the role, the outcome, or the structure that kept that identity alive, the ego reacts as though something unbearable is happening. And in one sense it is. Something is dying. But it is not your deepest self. It is the constructed self, the defended self, the imagined self, the self that could only exist through clinging. There is a reason certain losses leave you asking questions that seem bigger than the event itself. Why did this affect me so deeply? Why do I feel so empty? Why do I feel like I do not know who I am anymore? These are not only questions about the loss, they are questions about identity. Because when the false self begins to weaken, confusion often comes first. The old definitions no longer hold. The old attachments no longer stabilize you. The old story no longer explains your life. And for a while, you may feel like you are standing in a strange and unfamiliar inner landscape. This space can feel frightening. Because the mind likes certainty, even false certainty. It prefers a painful identity over no identity at all. It prefers a familiar illusion over an unfamiliar truth. That is why people often run back toward what life removed. Not because it is truly aligned, but because it supports the old self. It restores the familiar structure. It allows the false identity to survive a little longer. But what if the real invitation is not to rebuild the old structure? What if the real invitation is to let it collapse? This is the deeper spiritual opportunity hidden inside certain losses. Not just to survive them, but to allow them to reveal what was never truly solid. To allow them to strip away the identities that were built on attachment. To allow them to humble the ego that believed peace could be found in possession, status, control, or permanence. This does not mean loss is easy. It is still painful. It still shakes the heart. It still brings grief, confusion, and moments of deep vulnerability. But pain becomes different when it is seen clearly. When you understand that some losses are not only taking something from you, but also freeing you from something untrue, the suffering changes shape. It becomes more spacious, more meaningful, less like punishment and more like exposure. Because what is being exposed is not your weakness, it is your illusion, and illusion must be seen before it can be released. There is also something humbling in realizing how much of the self is built in relation to what can change. Most people think they know who they are, but often they know who they are in relation to certain conditions. I am this because I have that. I am loved because this person wants me. I am important because this role belongs to me. I am secure because this future seems possible. But when those conditions are removed, a terrifying silence can appear. And in that silence, the mind asks, then who am I? This question is painful, but it is sacred. because it points you away from the false self and towards something deeper. The Buddhist path does not ask you to become empty in a dead way. It asks you to become empty of illusion, empty of the false identities that create suffering, empty of the ego's constant need to secure itself through what is unstable, empty of the stories that turn changing conditions into permanent definitions. This emptiness is not loss of being, it is release of false being. It is the space in which the deeper self can finally breathe. The deeper self does not need to be praised to exist. It does not need to be chosen to feel real. It does not need to win to feel worthy. It does not need to control life to trust life. But this deeper self is often buried beneath years of attachment and identification. That is why certain losses feel like spiritual surgery. They cut through the surface identities. They remove what the ego used to decorate itself. They leave you face to face with what cannot be maintained through performance. And this can feel brutal before it feels liberating, because the false self had become familiar. Even if it was anxious, defensive, and fragile, it was known. And the unknown feels more frightening than illusion at first. This is why people sometimes grieve not only what they lost, but the version of themselves they can no longer be, the successful one, the desired one, the needed one, the admired one, the one with a clear future, the one who had it all together. These identities may have given confidence, but if they depended entirely on external conditions, they were never stable. They were temporary arrangements. And life, by removing what supported them, is sometimes inviting you into a deeper form of truth. A truth that does not depend on what can be taken away. A truth that does not collapse when circumstances shift. A truth that remains even when the false self trembles. There is a quiet freedom that begins when you stop asking every loss, "How do I get back what left?" and start asking, "What is this revealing about what I thought I was?" That question changes everything, because it turns pain into insight. It turns collapse into awakening. It turns the ending into a mirror. And in that mirror, you begin to see what was never truly you, the constant performer, the controller, the pleaser. The achiever who believed rest would come after one more success. The wounded lover who believed worth depended on being chosen. The fearful mind that believed safety could be built by keeping everything the same. These selves may have helped you navigate life, but they were not your essence. They were survival structures. And sometimes life removes what feeds them so that something truer can emerge. This emergence is not dramatic. It is quiet. It happens slowly, in the spaces where the old identity no longer makes sense. It happens in the moments when you stop reaching for the same old definitions. It happens when you sit with discomfort instead of immediately rebuilding the old image. It happens when you let the question remain open long enough for something real to answer. There is courage in this kind of surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of falsehood. The willingness to let the constructed self weaken without rushing to save it. The willingness to feel uncertain without grabbing the old identity for comfort. The willingness to let life take what it must take so that the deeper self can breathe. This is not passive. It is profoundly brave. Because the ego always wants quick reconstruction. It wants a new attachment, a new image, a new role, a new certainty. Anything to avoid the nakedness of not knowing. But growth often requires that nakedness. It requires the season where you do not yet know who you are without what left. It requires the silent period where the old self has faded, but the deeper self has not yet fully emerged. This in-between space is sacred. It is where illusion dies. It is where humility enters. It is where you begin to realize that what you are cannot be reduced to what you lost. The deeper self is often discovered not in triumph, but in stripping away. Not in accumulation, but in release. Not in becoming more impressive, but in becoming more honest. That honesty can feel raw. It can show you how much you depended on things you thought were love, but were really validation. How much you called purpose was really performance. How much you called discipline was really fear. How much you called devotion was really attachment. This clarity can sting, but it also frees. Because once illusion is seen, it loses some of its power. Once the false self is recognized, it becomes harder to confuse it with truth. And once truth begins to settle in, even gently, the grip of attachment begins to weaken. You stop needing life to support every image you built. You stop begging people to keep confirming the role you once played. You stop interpreting every loss as proof that you are less. And slowly, you begin to live from somewhere deeper. A place in you that is less dramatic, but more real. A place that does not rise and fall with every changing condition. A place that can grieve without collapsing. A place that can lose without becoming nothing. A place that can let illusion die without fearing that truth will disappear with it. This is why some things must leave. Not because they were worthless, not because they never mattered, but because their departure becomes part of your awakening. They reveal where you placed your selfhood. They expose where the ego was hiding. They loosen what was falsely permanent. And in doing so, they make possible a life that is less attached, less defended, less exhausted by the need to maintain illusion. When you begin to see certain losses this way, you stop asking only, "Why was this taken from me?" You begin to ask, "What false self could not survive without this?" That question is not meant to shame you. It is meant to free you. Because behind the false self is not emptiness in the fearful sense. Behind the false self is presence, awareness, a quieter identity that is not made of clinging, a steadier self that does not depend on being upheld by unstable things, and that self can finally begin to live when illusion is no longer constantly fed. This is why the path of letting go is not merely emotional, it is spiritual. It is not only about losing less painfully, it is about seeing more truthfully. And some truths only become visible when life removes what once kept them hidden. So when something leaves and part of you feels like it is dying, pause before assuming that something has gone wrong. It may be that something false is falling away. It may be that life is not only taking, but revealing. It may be that what hurts so deeply is not only the loss itself, but the weakening of the illusion you once called self. And if you can stay present through that, if you can resist the urge to rebuild the false self too quickly, if you can let the collapse teach instead of only wound, then something sacred begins to happen. You stop living as the one who must always be reinforced from the outside. You begin to live as the one who can remain, even when outer forms change. That is not emptiness in the painful sense. That is freedom. And as you begin to see that some losses are not only endings, but invitations to let the false self fall away, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. Not everything ends loudly. Some things end quietly, long before you admit they are over. A feeling fades. A connection loses its depth. A season shifts beneath your feet while everything on the surface still looks the same. And that is where this next lesson begins. There is a kind of pain that does not come from sudden loss, but from quiet misalignment. A slow, almost invisible drifting away from something that once felt alive. Nothing dramatic has happened, nothing has clearly broken, but something is no longer the same. And deep down, you can feel it. A subtle emptiness where there used to be meaning. A lack of energy where there used to be excitement. A silence where there used to be connection. This is what it feels like when a season has spiritually ended. But the mind does not always accept this easily, because externally things may still exist. The relationship may still be there. The job may still continue. The environment may not have changed in any obvious way. And so the mind holds on to what is visible, even when the invisible has already shifted. This is how suffering begins to grow. You are no longer fully present in what is, but you are not yet willing to release what was. You exist in between, trying to recreate a feeling that has already passed, trying to stay inside a chapter that life has already turned. This creates a kind of emotional friction because life is moving forward, but part of you is still anchored in the past. And that tension begins to show up in subtle ways. You may feel disconnected without knowing why. You may feel restless, even in places that once brought comfort. You may feel like you are going through the motions, but something inside you is no longer engaged. This is the quiet signal that a season has ended, not externally, but internally. And ignoring this signal does not keep the season alive. It only prolongs the discomfort of staying where you no longer belong. There is something important to understand about seasons. They are not meant to last forever. Each one carries a purpose, a period of growth, learning, connection, or transformation. And when that purpose has been fulfilled, something begins to change. The energy shifts, the alignment fades, the sense of flow begins to weaken. And while this can feel unsettling, it is natural. But the mind often resists this natural movement. It wants continuity, it wants stability, it wants to hold on to what once felt right. So it tries to revive the past, it revisits old memories, it tries to recreate old dynamics. It holds on to the belief that if nothing has visibly ended, then nothing has truly changed. But spiritual endings do not always announce themselves clearly. They happen quietly, they happen within. And recognizing them requires a kind of awareness that goes beyond surface appearances. There is also a fear that comes with acknowledging that a season has ended, because letting go of a season is not just about releasing what was happening externally. It is about releasing who you were within that season, the version of you that belonged there, the identity that was shaped by that time. And this can feel like a loss, because you are not just leaving something behind, you are leaving a part of yourself. And the mind resists that. It tries to hold on to that version of you, to keep that identity alive, even when life is asking you to move forward. This is why people stay longer than they should, in relationships that no longer grow, in environments that no longer support them, in patterns that no longer align with who they are becoming. Because leaving requires letting go of the familiar, and the familiar, even when it is no longer fulfilling, feels safe. There is also a deeper layer to this. Clinging to an ended season often comes from a belief that what comes next is uncertain, that the next chapter may not be as good, that there may be nothing waiting beyond what you already know. And this belief creates hesitation, a reluctance to step forward, a desire to stay where things are known, even if they are no longer alive. But staying does not bring life back to the season. It only creates a kind of stagnation, a feeling of being stuck, of not moving, not growing, not evolving. And over time, this stagnation begins to affect your sense of self. You may begin to feel disconnected from your own life, like you are present physically, but not fully engaged emotionally. Because part of you knows that something has ended, and another part refuses to accept it. There is also a subtle grief that comes with this, not the grief of sudden loss, but the grief of gradual change, of realizing that something meaningful is no longer what it once was, of feeling the distance between what you remember and what you are experiencing now. And this grief can be difficult to process, because it is not always clear, not always acknowledged, but it is there, and it needs to be felt. There is also a kind of honesty required in this process, the willingness to admit that something has changed, that the connection is no longer the same, that the environment no longer fits, that the version of you that belonged there has evolved. And this honesty can feel uncomfortable because it challenges the idea of permanence. It challenges the desire to hold on to what once felt right. But it also creates clarity, a clearer understanding of where you are and where you are being invited to go. There is also a sense of release that comes with acknowledging the end of a season. When you stop trying to force it to continue, something relaxes within you. The tension begins to fade. The inner conflict softens, because you are no longer trying to live in two different timelines at once. You are allowing yourself to be where you are now. There is also a shift in how you experience change. Instead of seeing it as something to resist, you begin to see it as something to move with. A natural progression, a transition from one phase to another, and this shift reduces the fear because you are no longer trying to stop the movement of life. You are participating in it. There is also a deeper sense of alignment that begins to form. As you release the old season, you create space for the new one to emerge, not immediately, not fully formed, but gradually. And this new season carries a different energy, different opportunities, different ways of being, but it cannot fully enter while you are still holding on to what has already ended. There is also a sense of renewal that comes with this transition, a feeling that something new is beginning, even if you cannot yet see it clearly. And this renewal brings a kind of quiet excitement, a curiosity about what lies ahead, a willingness to explore what is unfolding. There is also a deeper trust that develops, a trust in the natural rhythm of life, that things begin, grow, and end, and that each phase has its place and its purpose, and that holding on to one phase beyond its time does not preserve it. It only prevents the next one from fully arriving. There is also a sense of peace that comes with accepting the end of a season. Not because everything is certain, but because you are no longer resisting what is already happening. You are allowing the transition, allowing the change, allowing yourself to move forward. There is also a quiet strength in this, the strength to release what is familiar, the strength to step into the unknown, the strength to trust that life is not ending, but evolving. And this strength carries you into the next phase, not with force, but with openness, not with fear, but with acceptance. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges, that life is not a single, continuous story, but a series of chapters, each one with its own meaning, its own lessons, its own purpose. And trying to stay in one chapter forever limits the fullness of your experience, because growth requires movement, change requires transition, and life unfolds through these shifts. There is also a sense of freedom that comes with letting go of an ended season. You are no longer bound to what was, no longer defined by what used to be. You are free to become something new, to step into a different version of yourself, to explore new possibilities. And in that freedom, there is lightness, a feeling that you are no longer carrying the weight of trying to keep something alive that has already completed its purpose. There is also a quiet acceptance that forms, a recognition that endings are not always failures, that sometimes they are simply the natural conclusion of a phase, and that honoring that conclusion allows you to move forward with clarity and peace. And in that acceptance, something shifts. You stop trying to rewrite the past. You stop trying to hold on to what has already changed. You begin to move with life, to trust its rhythm, to follow its unfolding. And that is where your peace deepens. Not because everything stays the same, but because you are no longer trying to make it stay. You are allowing each season to come and go, and in that flow you remain grounded, present, and open to what comes next. There is a quiet truth that has been unfolding through every lesson you've just walked through. The pain was never only in the loss. It was in the resistance, It was in the gripping, the chasing, the replaying, the silent refusal to accept what life had already moved away from. It was in holding onto identities that had expired, relationships that had completed their purpose, expectations that were never promised, and seasons that had already ended beneath the surface. And slowly, you begin to see it. Life is not taking things away to punish you. It is clearing space. It is removing what no longer grows, what no longer aligns, what no longer carries truth for who you are becoming. But when you fight that process, when you try to keep what is already leaving, you turn a passing moment into a lasting wound. And that is where suffering lives, not in the ending, but in the refusal to let the ending be complete. But something changes the moment you loosen your grip. The moment you stop trying to control every outcome, stop trying to be remembered, chosen, returned to, or understood by people who have already drifted away. The moment you allow life to prune, to shift, to close chapters without forcing them open again. That is where peace begins to enter, not loudly but gently, like weight slowly leaving your chest, like silence becoming safe again, like your soul remembering how to breathe without holding on to anything. And now, I want to hear from you. What is one thing you've been holding on to that you know life has been asking you to release? Drop it in the comments. No explanations, no long stories, just that one thing. Sometimes naming it is the first step to finally letting it go. And if this spoke to something deep inside you, if it gave words to a feeling you've been carrying in silence, then take a moment to subscribe, because this is where we continue learning how to let go and finally feel free.